This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. Oh, we are back with another action-packed, dark, dingy, dusky episode of the podcast about the dark side of creativity, Art of Darkness. I'm Kevin Kautzman, joined by my co-conspirator, Brad Kelly. Brad, how are you?
I'm great, man. How are you doing?
I've been reading poetry in the shower. In my moldy, dingy basement summer shower, I am so obsessed with poesy and writing that I laminate poems, and bring them into the shower with me. Now, I'm kidding. Just like our subject, though, I'm not as obsessed with poetry as Roberto Bolaño was, and we'll be talking about him today. But I have to introduce my other co-conspirator, Abbie Lucas. Abbie, how are you?
I'm good. I am here with my Chilean wine, and I'm ready to confuse your audience with my strange accent and terrible Spanish pronunciation.
Oh, boy. I thought about that a half a dozen times as I was working on this. I'm like, ooh, I don't have Spanish. I really regret not studying Spanish. I'm going to be 40 soon.
Yeah.
You
should know how to pronounce
jalapeno
learn.
Jalapeno. I am probably never going to learn Spanish. I've accepted it. I've studied numerous languages. I truly regret not learning it. It would have been the most practical thing to learn. But of course, I had to go on and do German and Japanese and Latin. So valuable.
It's probably more practical than Italian, which I've sort of learned. And then the pronunciation's not even the same.
Nice.
Well,
that makes it easy.
Abbie, tell the audience a little bit about yourself. Obviously, you and I are screenwriting partners, and we've done a lot of damage to a number of concepts over the years.
Like Bolano, we have written a lot of very strange, dark things. And actually, the first project that we worked on together was an adaptation of a short story within The Savage Detective. So I feel like this is sort of come full circle. Yes. I'm a filmmaker originally from New Zealand, but I live in sunny London in the UK.
All right. Fabulous. So we're triangulating time zones. We are probably the three of us woefully unprepared to handle the nuances of Latin American literature. However, we are going to endeavor to do our best to give a profile that is rich about this phenomenal writer who had a great deal of success in his lifetime, but who probably was more successful posthumously, if that makes sense. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start with the classic Art of Darkness question for the Michigander himself, Brad Kelly. What do you know about Roberto Bolaño?
The little squiggly line goes over the N. I learned that.
It's called a tilde, isn't it?
Oh, a tilde. Okay. Well, see,
tilde.
I didn't want to. I knew that, but I figured if I said it and it wasn't that was even worse. So I'm pleading ignorance on that. No, he's an amazing writer. I have read 2666 and I've read The Savage Detectives. Both of them masterpieces in their own way, but very, very different. So it's kind of interesting that he managed to pull off both of those books. They're strikingly different to me, but both of them amazing. I don't know much about him as a person at all, really. other than maybe, glancing at his Wikipedia page. I do know that 2666, it was either published posthumously or the English translation was published posthumously or something like that. It came out kind of right at the end of his life. I know that. And it was it was a smashing success. Especially for such a doorstopper of a book. I don't know when the last book of that size was like being talked about by everyone.
Infinite Jest, I would say.
Probably, yeah. It's sort of in that category, just in terms of like a literary.
Right, 2666 is the number of pages. I'm kidding.
Well,
not quite.
It depends on the margins. Probably it's close.
We got to lower the font. We will talk about some theories about the origin, why it's called 2666.
I never totally understood it, but anyway.
Yeah, I think that I can't exactly recall off the top of my head, but it sounds like Abbie will cover that. If not, we'll quick look it up on the fly. I think I remember. Anything else, Brad, that you know about Roberto Bolaño?
That's about it. I, like a lot of South American writers, I know that he had some political / legal problems, but I don't really know the nature of them. I just know that, at one time or another, some political party was upset with him, maybe imprisoned him. I'm not sure the details of that. And I believe he was a journalist at some point as well. Did some journalism. But yeah, I guess that's about it.
All right.
I'm excited for this because
good.
I mean, yeah,
we're going to go into it. And again, I want to reiterate the humility and the modesty that we bring to this. We are not, it's so difficult to cover an author when you don't speak the language. So we bring that sense of perspective to it. But he's so worth covering because the work is extraordinary, and he really is legitimately the most important Latin American author of the past 20 or 30 years. Fair to say, Abbie? Pretty.
Yeah, I would say. I mean,
yeah.
my knowledge of Latin American authors isn't vast, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a good guy to know.
Good guy to know.
Good guy to know. All right, so let's talk about the texts that we're going to lean on. So Abbie has a number of the novels. I have a little bit of poetry because, of course, he began his life as a poet, and he would later mine his experiences as an insufferable young poet in Mexico City with the other insufferable young poets for a great novel called The Savage Detectives, which really put him on the map in terms of popular literature. I have two books. I have Bolano, A Biography and Conversations by Monica Marston, and then I have Roberto Bolaño, between parentheses, essays, articles, and speeches from 98 to 03, so near the end of his life, not to get ahead of things, translated by Natasha Vimmer. And then here's just an interesting little pull quote on the back. Bolaño has proven that literature can do anything. Jonathan Lethem, The New York Times. It's quite high praise, and I think as we dig into Bolaño and his work, of course, Brad, you're a novelist, so I think this will be of a special interest to you. We'll see that he really did bend the form of the novel to his will.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And his project was literature itself, was writing about writing. He wrote a lot about writing. So we're going to see in The Savage Detectives that he wrote about this cadre of poets from his formative years. And then we'll see in 2666. People pronounce it differently. They say 2666 or 2666. I think I'll just use them interchangeably. And if I sound like a Philistine to somebody, find us on the Bird website and yell at me. We're at Art of Dark Pod. And of course, well, in 2666, he much of it is about a writer, a mythical, like a made-up writer he created named Arcamboldi, and we'll cover that as well. But it's so interesting because he was a man of the left, and yet he sort of confessed that he never became a writer for the workers. He's certainly a writer's writer. Mm-hmm. All right. So, and the format of this is we're gonna walk you through his life with an emphasis on the work, and Abbie's going to read from different segments of the work, And I guess let's begin. Why not? Let's start at the beginning. So we have a childhood in Chile. He was born in 1953 in Santiago, the son of a truck driver who was also a boxer and a teacher. So here we have somebody who would become quite bookish, whose father was a boxer. They spent their early years in southern and coastal Chile. By his own account, he was skinny, nearsighted, and bookish, an unpromising child. He was dyslexic, and there's an interview we'll get to later, the final interview, which was with Playboy Mexico, where he talks about how he was left-handed, so it was difficult to masturbate. He was left-footed, so he had a very, very great sense of humor, and a dark sense of humor. And he was left-footed, so soccer wasn't very good, but he wrote with his right hand. So he was a little kind of a man out of whack, a boy out of whack from the go. He felt like an outsider at school. He was bullied. All right, one of us. Came from a lower middle class family. His mother was a fan of bestsellers. They were not intellectual. He had one younger sister. He was 10 when he started his first job selling bus tickets. And then the family moved to Los Angeles, Bio Bio. I don't know very much about Chile, other than he called it the corridor, the nation shaped like a corridor. It's a big, long sliver kind of at the end of the world there in South America. Bolaño's father, Leon, was a professional boxer and truck driver, as I said. He remembered his son as an unusual kid who took walks and read a lot and showed no interest in money. The father said, "Sometimes I gave him 5 pesos and he said to me, 'No, that's too much. Give me 2.'" What can that mean? It's such an interesting fact. Yeah. So now I'm going to start pulling from the biography and conversations here. And if I miss a beat once in a while, it's just because I've got all this paper in these books, and we're going to be going all around the world here. So I'm just going to read a little bit about his childhood. So Bolaño would chiefly recall the food in Chile, including a pepper plantation that was cultivated by a worker hired by his father on a small plot of land in Quilpue. And here's quoting Bolaño. "The hellish part in Chile was my childhood and adolescence, and then the coup d'etat. But I liked Chilean food." What a funny move there to talk about the coup d'etat and then go to food. The coup and then dinner. "Have you ever tried it? It's pretty good cuisine. Empanadas, corn tart, humitas, Chilean stew, seafood, perhaps the best I've ever had. That sauce they call pebre, which may be simple but is nonetheless very effective. Carcacan, which is a dish that dates back to before the War of Independence, and they say was Manuel Rodriguez's favorite." So, yeah, it's just interesting. It's saying here that Bolaño's childhood in Chile was idyllic despite some later protestations to the contrary. These were the early years of his parents' marriage, which would later disintegrate. But the family was close at the time. On the weekends, Victoria Avalos' father would come to eat chicken cooked in the clay oven Leon had built in the country house in Quilpue. It was all very pretty, Leon remembers. So painting a little picture of his childhood, Chile, and I suppose you'd say the politics of exile would play very heavily on him. He would write his novels later in life, and he would write about Chile and he would write about Mexico, which would later become kind of his adopted home before he would eventually move to Spain. He's one of these. We'll get to it, but this idea of exile is really central to his conception of himself. We're going to read a little bit from. You're going to like this, Brad. A little bit from. This is the other book between parentheses. This is from Bolaño. I was born in 1953, the year that Stalin and Dylan Thomas died. Dylan Thomas, he keeps haunting this podcast. Yeah. Can we do an episode where we don't mention Dylan Thomas?
Not anymore. No. No.
In 1973, I was detained for 8 days by the military, which had staged a coup in my country. And in the gym where the political prisoners were held, I found an English magazine with pictures of Dylan Thomas's house in Wales. I had thought that Dylan Thomas died poor, but the house looked wonderful, almost like a fairy tale cottage in the woods. There was no story about Stalin. But that night, I dreamed of Stalin and Dylan Thomas. The two of them were at a bar in Mexico City, sitting at a little round table, a table for arm wrestling. But instead of wrestling, they were competing to see who could hold his liquor better. The Welsh poet was drinking whiskey, and the Soviet dictator was drinking vodka. As the dream went on, however, I was the only one who seemed to feel queasier and queasier, ever closer to the verge of nausea. Well, there you have the story of my birth.
Whoa. Wow. Yeah, that's great.
So I think that's a good taste of the wit and the strangeness of him, and why he's such a compelling writer. Now, we're skipping around a little bit, but let's sort of stay on the biography here now. So in 1968, he moved with his family to Mexico City. So as a teenager, he'd have been 14 or 15. He dropped out of school, worked as a journalist, and became active in left-wing political causes. You were right, Brad. He worked as a journalist.
Mm-hmm.
Bolaño didn't do well in school, often talking back to teachers and correcting them. We know how teachers love that. They love that. When the kid with the funny accent, the scrawny kid with the funny accent from Chile comes to Mexico City and starts correcting you, that's going to play really well. His father remembers a teacher calling to say, "Your son is right, but tell him not to say so in front of others because it makes the teacher look ridiculous." Boy, oh boy. In Mexico, Bolaño was expelled from school for the same know-it-all attitude that caused him trouble in Chile. So he carried his problems from Chile to Mexico. That's quite a big move too. I'm trying to think of what would be comparable. I mean, it'd be like moving. Geez, I mean, you speak Spanish. I mean, I guess it might be moving like from California to Texas or something. I don't know if there's a comparable thing in America even, because it's a different nation entirely. That's a really serious move. And Mexico City is one of the biggest cities in the world. Wonderful place.
Yeah, it would be. That would be a pretty crazy move, I would think.
As a teen too.
Yeah.
All right. So I have another bit from the, let's see here. Yeah. From moving to Mexico here. Let me see. Let's see here. So this is someone saying of Roberto. Let's see. Oh, yes, of course. They moved to Mexico because of his mother's poor health. She suffered from chronic asthma. So this is an important note. We already know this marriage is going to disintegrate, and of course that would have an effect on Roberto. According to Bolaño's father, they started to treat her in Mexico on the recommendation of a Mexican doctor. I stayed with the two children in Chile, sent her off for a few months, and she came back well. That's how it was for me. I was screwed. I had to pay for the trip and the hotel and the doctor. But in the end, it didn't do any good because the year she came back, the bronchitis flared up again. A doctor who was a friend of mine told me that if she always recovered in Mexico, we should go to live there or my children would end up without a mother. I mean, wow. I sold everything I had in Chile and we went to live in Mexico City. Roberto was 15 at the time. The four of us lived together for a few years until my wife and I separated. I kept Roberto and she went to Spain with our daughter.
Whoa.
So that's pretty heavy.
Yeah.
That's going to set you up for a little bit of intensity. Let's read a writer, a poet, Jaime Quezada, writing who lived with them at the invitation of Bolaño's mother. A poet wrote a book called Bolaño Before Bolaño, to give you an idea of what a big deal Bolaño was, right? Like, I mean, if you die and leave some books behind and people start writing books about you, you've done something. Here's an excerpt from that. At the time, he was an 18, 19-year-old boy. He had come to Mexico with his parents when he was very young, several years before the military coup of 73. By now, he had basically left secondary school and spent his days and nights reading and rereading Kafka, Eliot, Proust, Joyce, Borges, Paz, Cortázar, Marquez, and smoking and smoking. Bolaño was a chain smoker. Contrary to the rumor that went around, he did not drink heavily, and he did not do heroin. We'll get to this.
A rumor about a heroin problem that apparently didn't exist.
Oh.
Well, the moral of the story, of course, is always don't do heroin. And we talk about that a lot on Art of Darkness. Oh, I did skip a beat. We have a Patreon. It's at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. If you enjoy what we do on this show, subscribe. And with every episode, you get an extra 20 to 30 minutes of content. We call those After Dark. And on this After Dark, we are going to talk about Bolaño and women. And the relationship he had to women.
Okay.
So that, I think, should be extra spicy, extra fun. And so I really do encourage you to support the show. We put a lot of work into this. If you enjoy it, artofdarkpod.com, patreon.com/artofdarkpod. All right. So imagine a smoker. I mean, we're talking about 18 or 19, and he's already chain smoking. And drinking big mugs of milky tea, always angry with himself or someone else. An anger that didn't sit well on his pale, smooth face of precocious intellectual haze. Smooth face or precocious intellectual gaze. Roberto was something of a Caspar Hauser. You know what a Caspar Hauser is?
No.
It's Caspar Hauser was a kid who just showed up out of the woods, like a feral kid, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
The outstanding Werner Herzog film, The Enigma of Caspar Hauser, is about this. Yes. He's a foundling. So he's wild, and it was like he was raised by wolves or raised in a basement. He never left the bedroom, living room, dining room, except to go to the bathroom or to declaim something loudly, pulling on his thick head of hair about a passage in the book he was reading, or to accompany me patiently. He was such a patient and impatient reader. To the soda fountain on the corner where I drank a beer and he had a guava smoothie. 18 or 19 years old, Kafka, Eliot, Proust, Joyce, Borges, Paz.
Going hard.
Hard. So let's see here. There's some other really good stuff here. We're going to get into, 1968. I believe the Olympic Games were in Mexico City in 1968. There was a great deal of upheaval, in the country. We'll get to this when we talk about the novel Amulet that he wrote. And here's an interesting anecdote about his father during their time in Mexico City. I'm just trying to imagine what the vibe must have been like in the late 60s in Mexico City, and the wardrobe. I mean, it's just a world that I'm having a hard time imagining. Yeah. Leon, his father, worked hard at various jobs his whole life to put a roof over his children's heads and food on their table. And Roberto, in fact, was economically dependent on his father until he was past 20 years old. A silence lasting nearly 2 decades came between them after the son asked his father from Europe. So we're flashing forward. This is when Roberto would finally move to Spain. But Roberto asked his father from Europe for a few dollars as an advance on my inheritance. And the father said, that upset me a lot. An advance on what inheritance? I hadn't died yet, said an elderly Bolaño. So, okay. We're painting a picture of Roberto here. There's an another interesting anecdote about his attitude toward this rock song, and this comes from the poet Jaime Quesada. When he was 18, Roberto thought that he was a character from a rock song and said to his friend, "It's as though that song were written about me. It's about a boy who can barely sleep at night." And at one point he says to his father, "Father, I can't sleep." The father remembers an old photograph he has on his desk. He looks for the picture and hands it to him. The photograph is a pornographic image of a naked woman. The boy looks at the lurid photo several times. He gets turned on and masturbates with his left hand, no doubt. And then he goes to sleep happily without any trouble. The next day he says to his father, "Introduce me to the girl in the photograph." And the father answers, "But she died 40 years ago." And that's how the rock story ends. It's a great, genuine story for a song. Bolaño was talking about the song Pictures of Lily by The Who. Roberto, who compared his life with that of the ordinary boy in the lyrics of a rock song, continued to see himself throughout his life as a literary character, a fictional person. Proof of this comes from the letters he wrote to his friends, which Bolaño's first publisher, the American Juan Pascoe, describes as literary acts, not personal letters. He was not really writing. He was writing what he wanted to write at that moment. He was writing for an audience, creating a document for posterity. So we're getting an interesting picture of him. I like this image of him thinking of himself as fictional. What an interesting
and that takes us to 2666. I mean, not that I don't want to go there yet, but in 2666 he poses a fictional writer as one of the characters, right?
It's a real writer.
Oh, is it?
But,
okay.
Yeah,
okay.
it is a real writer. But
okay.
Yes, definitely a writer as one of the characters in 2666, and all throughout Savage Detectives and in shades of other novellas. That there actually is his alter ego as a writer who crops up all the time, which we'll go into.
Okay, yeah. Cool.
What did he call himself in Savage Detectives? It wasn't
Arturo Bolano.
Bolano, right? He's not even covering it up.
No,
casting himself in the novel.
Yeah.
Well, they say write what you know. I want to get another little section from this time, from his youth. This is his father. Leon was a well-built middleweight, ate like an athlete, and was sometimes covered in the local sports press. He says that Roberto inherited his confrontational attitude and bravery from him. To prove it, he has in his possession a logbook from his time in the Navy in Chile. It is full of censures, he says, for showing a lack of respect to an officer, for hitting an officer, and for things like that. So Roberto, his father was pretty aggressive. And of his son, Leon said, Roberto had a lot of balls. He never gave up. He was incredible. Have you read his interviews on the internet? He gave the journalists a kick up the ass. He practically called them huevonos, idiots, as they say in Chile. He had a strong character and saw things very clearly. When in his last interview, Bolaño was asked to describe what Latin American scenes came to mind, one of his answers was, my father's truck broken down on a desert road. The father remembers this too. When we lived in Valparaiso, I had a big 30-ton truck, and on the journey before we got to La Serena, an injection pump blew out. Hell, what a problem. I was alone in my truck with my kid. Roberto would have been about 4 years old. We were alone in the middle of the desert. Fortunately, a friend passed by and I asked him to get a mechanic. He was an Italian who always fixed my truck when I was on the road. I only had a little water. Roberto would say he was thirsty and I'd give him some water. Then he'd ask, aren't you going to drink? I wasn't. I was worried it would run out. Suddenly I saw smoke off in the distance. It was a house, a very humble one. I gave the lady there a 40-kilo bag of flour and she made some bread. We ate that for 3 days until the mechanic arrived. Then we started out on our journey again. My son was asleep in the cabin when suddenly something flew very fast right over the truck. It was an Army mail plane that landed on the sand. They used the truck as a marker to land. I was terrified and Roberto cried a lot. Imagine a plane flying that close to you.
Wow.
Oh, boy.
Holy smokes.
Yeah. This image of remembering this truck broken down at the desert at the age of 4. Let's read a little bit more from Leon here. Leon loved tango. He said that he owed nothing to life and had never had a bad time in his long existence. And then about Roberto, he said, my son was a good son. He greeted everyone very politely. Guadalupe Tepeyac was full of hippies who got him into marijuana and that kind of thing. I said to him, Roberto, don't get involved with those people. And he answered, don't worry, Papa, there won't be any trouble. Roberto was never a drug addict. He just met with his friends to drink coffee, write, and exchange ideas. So that's an interesting myth that maybe we can dispel. Well, I want to think we've talked a lot about his father. I think we need to talk about his mother briefly here, just to give her a little bit of due. Let me see here. So Victoria, who died of respiratory failure in 2008 at 81 years old in the Catalan town of Figueres, where she lived, praised her son for the generosity with which he rescued the young addicts from the beach in Blanes, and for especially his enormous goodwill. He was a very lovely person. He liked everyone. She recalls that Roberto as a child was playful. He liked to play cowboys, jump around, ride a bicycle. He was very close to his friends. He was a kind of Robin Hood to them. He was always giving them presents. And later on, when he was older, he worried a lot about his friends and also about young people. Against her husband's will, Victoria supported her son in his wish to dedicate himself completely to literature and always trusted in his talent. Her influence wasn't just decisive in his literary formation, but also because she was there whenever he needed her. I don't like it when people say that he was extremely poor. The truth is that we never wanted for anything. It was just that he wanted to take care of everything himself. And the thing is that he always managed it. So here we have another figure in Art of Darkness who is one of these characters who does the work despite everything. Does it with this monomaniacal purity, which I think we will come to see. All right, we're going to move forward in the biography. Abbie, do you have anything else to add here as a sort of paint the picture of his character? We will get to the work.
No, not yet.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack. He's an interesting character.
He is an interesting dude. Yeah,
yeah. It's a case where again we try not to psychologize our writers, but he's and I don't know that I would even know where to begin here. Short of the fact,
a lot of things that you've said that I didn't know about him is sort of clicked in terms of some of the themes that come up in the books and things like that. I've been making some notes actually. Yeah, it's a very interesting life he led.
Yes, he surely did. And this point about the parents moving from Chile to Mexico for his mother's health, the gravity of that really dawned on me. And of course, we will see something as tragic or even more tragic befall him later and color a great deal of the writing, particularly 2666. So let's move on to his brief return to Chile. So a key episode in Bolaño's life, mentioned in different forms in several of his works, occurred in 1973. And this, by the way, is disputed. Some people argue that this never happened, that he made this up as part of his myth making. I don't really know what the verdict is.
All part of the mystique of Bolaño.
Yes, he certainly had and has mystique, for sure. We're not trying to dispel any of it. But this was in 1973. So he would have been 20 years old, I believe. That's right, 19 to 20. Right. Yeah, when he left Mexico for Chile to help build the revolution by supporting. That's never good. Okay. By supporting the democratic socialist government of Salvador Allende. After Pinochet's right-wing military coup against Allende, Bolaño was arrested on suspicion of being a terrorist and spent 8 days in custody. He was rescued by two former classmates who had become prison guards. Bolaño describes this experience in the story Dance Card. According to the version of events he provides in this story, he was not tortured as he had expected, but in the small hours he could hear them torturing others. Oof. You're gonna listen to this podcast. I could hear him torturing. I couldn't help sleep, and there was nothing to read except a magazine in English that someone had left behind. The only interesting article in it was about a house that had once belonged to Dylan Thomas. Again, we're haunted.
Yeah.
I got out of that hole thanks to a pair of detectives who had been at high school with me. The episode is also recounted from the point of view of Bolaño's former classmates in the story Detectives. Nevertheless, since 2009, Bolaño's Mexican friends from that era have cast doubts on whether he was even in Chile in 1973 at all. Jay-Z never really slung dope or whatever it is. And I don't sick the dogs on me, but it's that kind of a vibe.
Yeah,
Like,
so you think he would be doing that to get like credit in the political world? Or
yes, I am a real leftist.
Yeah.
One of the things that I read was sort of like, it was kind of in the middle, like not he went there for, you know, the revolution, or he wasn't there at all. There's a thing here in the back of Savage Detectives that says in 1973, when Bolaño was 20, he decided to go home to Chile, taking the longland route down the Pacific coast. There he planned to take part in a people's theater project. And as luck would have it, he arrived in Santiago just a few months before the Pinochet coup. So I think one of the theories is that he was going there for artistic reasons and just found himself part of this coup. Fighting this coup. And
an even greater sin than fomenting left-wing revolution. He went to do theater.
He went to do theater. And then the torture he describes was that there was one English magazine that he could read and nothing else.
So perhaps a little bit of fabrication, a little bit of hyperbole. Hard to say.
Oh, yeah.
But
I mean, it's not a good story. I'm going down there for theater, and then okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I like this overland trip from Mexico City to Chile, though. That sounds awesome.
It's like we all go on the Bolano tour.
Yeah.
Pilgrimage.
I would definitely be down to do that. I would have to learn a little bit of Spanish, though, for sure.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So he had a really, we're not going to dwell way too much on this because we could literally make the entire episode about this, but he had conflicted feelings about Chile. He ferociously attacked Isabel Allende and other members of the literary establishment. I don't believe that he ever won the major Chilean writing prize. A bit of a, he burned too many bridges. He was too much of an enfant terrible and just wasn't da-da-da. So quoting someone here, he didn't fit into Chile, and the rejection that he experienced left him free to say whatever he wanted, which could be a good thing for a writer. That's Ariel Dorfman, a Chilean Argentinian novelist and playwright. And so we're going to move into the poetry phase, which was much more than a phase that maybe you and I had if we ever dabbled with poetry. This was quite intense, and we're going to have some fun with this. So on his overland return from Chile to Mexico in 1974, Bolaño allegedly passed an interlude in El Salvador, spent in the company of the poet Roque Dalton and the guerrillas of the Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front, through the veracity of this episode has been cast into doubt. Again, we're blending fiction and reality.
Yeah.
In the 60s, Bolaño, who was an atheist since he was young, became a Trotskyite, and in 1975, a founding member of I'm going to try to say it in Espanol. Infrarrealismo.
Oh, I like that name. I like that name.
Nerds.
Yeah, exactly.
A minor poetic movement, which I'm trying to.
That's being generous, I think.
Yeah. I
started like 3 or 4 minor poetic movements when I
yeah. Sounds like something you do
real minor.
After you wake up, you have some coffee, you have a minor poetic movement. Has there been a major poetic movement since the 70s? I mean, let's be realistic about this. Well, we just did our Berryman episode. You can go back and listen to that. That episode itself was kind of poetic.
Yeah.
So now this is the movement that he would parody in the major novel, The Savage Detectives.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Which we will get to. And I kind of love this as this insufferable kind of teenage post-adolescent scene that he would later mine for this rather commercial novel. And when I mentioned earlier that his friends in Mexico kind of cast doubt on the authenticity of some of his claims, that may all be tangled together with the fact that after he finally wrote The Savage Detectives about this period, there were some hard feelings.
Oh, I bet.
It'd be like if Brad, if you penned a novel about your difficult podcast co-host
Right.
many years from now, I might not.
Yeah.
I might want to get a little revenge.
Sure. Fair enough.
Hopefully it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But do you understand what I mean? It's like you have this crazy time with all your college buddies, and then you lift the skirt many years later.
Well, especially if you're making fun of it in any way, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And making money.
Right. And making money. Right.
Mm-hmm. I want to make it right, of course, because of this movement was a super like proto-punk against all of that, right? We're here to change the world. Literature is food. Who needs to eat? We have poetry. Just this sort of insufferable kind of thing, right? It's like, oh God. Okay, so I want to read something. This is again from Bolano, A Biography and Conversations. I should say we have a link to a bookstore on our website, don't we, Brad?
But if you go into artofdarkpod.com, I think it's bookshop.org. So yeah, if you click that link, that affiliate link on our website, and you buy any books through that link, we will get a few pennies. You will also support a great independent bookstore. I haven't done a great job of keeping it up, but there's also lists of books about and by subjects that we've covered in the show.
Yes, and you've started to evolve the YouTube channel too. And
YouTube's growing. Yeah, it's fun. Yeah.
All right, right on. Yeah, and you can find all the links on the website.
That's easy to find on our website, artofdarkpod.com.
All right, good. So this is about the infrarealists, and then I want to hear a little bit from Abbie. But so the notorious infrarealist literary movement, with which Bolaño would be deeply identified throughout his life, was founded at the start of 1976 in the home of a Chilean poet and close friend of Bolaño's, Bruno Montagne. He appears in The Savage Detectives as the character Philippe Müller. Born in Santiago de Chile in 1957, Bruno is the brother of the painter Alvaro Montagne. Bruno left Chile in 1974 at 17 after the military coup had put his father, an archaeologist, out of work. Montagne's parents still live in Sonora, a city in the north of Mexico, where the third part of The Savage Detectives is set, where they moved after living for a period in Mexico City. Bruno met Bolaño, who had by then been living in Mexico for 6 years, through Jaime Quezada, who we heard from earlier, who gave him the Montagne brothers' address in Mexico City. They immediately hit it off and started to publish things together. First came an anthology of young Chilean poets with the help of former Spanish Republican exiled in Mexico, Juan Rejano, who also appears briefly in The Savage Detectives. Then they published their first poems in El Nacional, whose cultural supplement was run by Rejano. Thinking back, Bruno especially remembers the close friendship between Bolaño and Mario Santiago, whom Bolaño called the best poet I ever met, an amazing talent. Santiago and Bolaño met at La Habana Cafe in 1975. We were all very innocent adolescents who knew something about a few things and nothing about a lot more. And I want to hear now from Bolaño, and this is from a Chilean television program about the origins of infrarealism. And then we've got to read an excerpt from their manifesto.
Oh, yeah, manifestos are great.
Yes. So I'll read this from Bolaño, and then I want to hear a little bit from Abbie, and then we'll read some from the manifesto. Manifestos are great. We got to wait for Ted Kaczynski to die, Brad.
Yeah,
and then we can
it's a personal favorite genre of mine.
Bolaño, Mario Santiago and I founded infrarealism. At the time, we were pretty irresponsible, and our theoretical arguments were fairly incoherent. Essentially, what annoyed many people in the Mexican literary establishment was that we weren't aligned with any of the cliques or powerful groups. In Mexican literature, there had always been groups of writers and their samurai. We weren't with any of them. We weren't with the left. It was a Stalinist, dogmatic, authoritarian left, a horrible left. Neither were we with the elegant right, which wasn't elegant at all. Theirs was a moth-eaten elegance. We weren't with the avant-garde, who were only interested in earning money and whose ideas of the avant-garde were stuck far in the past. What we did was annoy everyone. I remember that someone in a moment of great inspiration, their only moment of great inspiration, published a text that said, "Send Bolano back to Santiago. Santiago too." They couldn't stand us in Mexico. It was complete and utter hatred. They didn't like us at all. That was who the Infrarealists were. Then I left for Spain and never went back to Mexico. In contrast, Mario, who spent some time living in Europe and the Middle East, went back. They made him pay for it dearly. Now that he's dead, lots of people are coming out of the woodwork to say that he was a great poet, but they waited until he was dead to say so. I feel embarrassed about my work from that time, almost as though it were written by another writer, because I've changed as a poet and writer. There was one great poet in that group, Mario Santiago, while I was the agitator. Of course, Mario Santiago was more of an agitator than I was, but I wasn't even close to him as poet. My move to Europe changed my perspective on my poetry. So again, getting a little out of order there, but that's him reflecting back on the infrarealism. And I think they would go, Abby, wouldn't they go and just sort of disrupt readings or be just obnoxious? What was there?
Yeah, so there was in Mexico at the time, there was this boom of artists where the government was paying or supporting or funding like some artists who were, you know, the nice safe artists, and Roberto Bolaño and this Mario Santiago were kind of against all of that, and they would turn up at other artists, poets like readings, and just like stand up at the back and shout out their own poetry, and yeah, just disrupt things and all of that kind of stuff. And I've got an excerpt here that sort of talks about one of the first times that they did this. It says, in Mexico City in 1976, a 23-year-old with wild hair and aviator glasses stood up in the Libreria Gandhi, one of the bookstores that unwittingly supplied him with free books, and read a manifesto urging his fellow poets to give up everything for literature, to follow the example of Rimbaud and hit the road. The true poet, he said, should abandon the coffee house and take part of the sharpshooters, the lonesome cowboys, the spat upon supermarket shoppers and their massive individual collective disjunctives, the cunning, the lonely, the unnoticed, and the despised. And this was Roberto Bolaño reading out the manifesto for infrarealism titled Leave It All Again. Yeah, and he would follow this for 2 decades, sort of moving from menial day job to menial day job and writing poetry by night, until he later moved on to novels, which was for other reasons. But yeah, they'd essentially disrupt things. They didn't really, I mean, if the accounts in the Savage Detectives are sort of to be taken as autobiographical, they didn't really know that much about poetry. There's sort of like anecdotal evidence that Roberto Bolaño wasn't even a very good poet. Mm-hmm. And I think his former sort of infrarealist friends had viewed him as a sellout when he eventually moved into writing novels, and he would fight back this. Sorry, he would fight back this and say, you know, that the movement died when he left Mexico. So
I am in for realism.
Right.
I am in for realism.
So like, yeah, so his friends who are into realists are like deep into their 40s and they're still like pounding this drum. Like,
yeah, I mean, it sounds like that was the case. They were all just hanging out in Mexico City,
right.
Arguing in coffee shops and ready to like fight each other about literature.
Hey, okay.
We know the type, man. It's a type.
But I mean, I guess like at that age, especially, well, I mean, I think people in today times at that age still find themselves to be like the writer as the revolutionary, but like definitely then that would have been a revolutionary act to be a writer.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's in the lead up to this episode, I've been tweeting about little one tweet kind of mini episodes of Art of Darkness and all South American writers. And like every single one of them, almost every single one of them either spent time in jail as like for political reasons, was exiled, or became a politician of some kind. So it's all like, and I think the lines were blurry to them a little bit more so than maybe I'm only really deeply familiar with American literary culture. But we don't have a lot of writers in America who became like senators. There's not a whole lot of those, but like in South America,
maybe some failed ones.
Yeah.
There's you've got a case with this J.D. Vance character wrote that novel, and now he's kind of moving.
Yeah,
so
it's there a little bit,
but it's not.
But it's all of them
same.
in South America. They're all like, and then he ran for mayor, and then he,
right. What are we? We're doing something wrong. Go on, Abby.
Perhaps this is why he needed to jazz up his Chile, going back to Chile story. And, we've got his mother disputing whether he was actually poor. It's all like not very for realist, is it?
It is sort of amusing that like leftist cred is about how badly you can be beaten down. You're poor. It's like you identify with the suffering of the masses and all of that. Yeah. Interesting. Shall I read a bit from the manifesto?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go on.
So I just want you to imagine you're 19 years old. It's hot. You're in Mexico City. There are whiffs of revolution in the air. You haven't shaved your neck beard in a week. You're surviving off of tacos from stands outside. Maybe you haven't eaten all day because you don't have a dime to your name. You're sitting down with your friends, and this is what you write about your writing. Curtains of water, cement, or tin separate a cultural mechanism which serves as both the conscience and the asshole of the ruling class, from a living cultural event scrubbed clean in constant death and birth, ignorant of most of history and the fine arts, quotidian creator of its own insane story and its amazing fine arts body that suddenly tests new sensations on itself, product of an epoch in which we approach at 200 kilometers per hour the toilet or the revolution. New forms, rare forms, as old Bertolt said, half curious and half smiling. Okay. What you're on.
I mean, if you print out and read the Infrarealist Manifesto, it really is a bunch of incomprehensible nonsense. And like what I imagine, like David Lynch's 3 a.m. notes app sort of like writings to look like.
Yeah, there's that quality. You can see the influence of Rimbaud on them. And
I will say, as far as manifestos go, that one is like, it's got much better imagery than most manifestos.
It does have some good imagery.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So I'm gonna give them a couple points in the.
Well, let's see. I mean, what are they really saying here? Let's see. About infrarealism. The infrarealists propose indigenous to the world, a crazy and timid Indian. What? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. A new lyricism, which is starting to rise Latin America, supports itself in ways that never fail to amaze us. The way into matter is ultimately the way into adventure. The poem is a journey, and the poet is a hero revealing heroes. Tenderness like an exercise in speed, breathing in heat, the shotgun experience, structures that are devouring themselves, crazy contradictions. If the poet is mixed up, the reader will have to mix himself up. Erotic books without spelling.
Without spelling?
Yeah, without spelling.
Maybe we're missing something in translation, but I don't think we're missing.
No,
sense of what it is.
Almost all of the like writing manifestos, if you read them, they're like, and we're gonna write really hard and more, and it's gonna be like writing, but more so. Right. Damn it! Yeah, they're all.
Yeah, we're maybe making a little bit of mockery of the infrarealists, and maybe we should.
I think we're also mocking maybe all
20-something writers who are
writers, including me.
And then he would go on to also mock himself, saying that they were just college-aged and pretentious.
Right. Yeah,
and annoying.
Yeah, pretentious and confident enough to disrupt your reading after you've won the Guggenheim or whatever it is, the Mexican Guggenheim Prize, and now you've got these unwashed, smelly Trotskyite infrarealists in the back of your reading. Kind of funny. It's kind of amusing in a way. But he took poetry deathly seriously, and I don't think that with certainty, if Bolaño had not gone through this phase, we wouldn't have had the novels the way that they would become. This is all the germ of what would come later. He had a quote about poetry. He said, "Poetry is braver than anyone," and I quite like that. Here's a poem from him. Abbie, I feel like I've gone on a lot. Do you feel like reading this poem, When Lisa Told Me?
Okay, I can read the poem. All right. When Lisa told me she'd made love to someone else in that Tepeyac warehouse phone booth, I thought my world was over. A tall, skinny guy with long hair and a long cock who didn't wait more than one date to penetrate her deep. It's nothing serious, she said, but it's the best way to get you out of my life. Parmendius Garcia Saldana had long hair and could have been Lisa's lover, but some years later I found out he died in a psych ward or killed himself. Lisa didn't want to sleep with losers anymore. Sometimes I dream of her and see her happy and cold in Mexico drawn by Lovecraft. We listened to music, Canned Heat, one of Parmendia Garcia Saldana's favorite bands, and then we made love 3 times. First he came inside me, then he came in my mouth, and a third time, barely a thread of water, a short fishing line between my breasts. And all in 2 hours, said Lisa. The worst 2 hours of my life, I said from the other end of the phone.
Wow.
Whoa.
So
the funny thing is that kind of sounds like his prose when you listen to it on an audiobook.
Indeed. So there's a poem about being cucked, and we have a bit of a Bukowski vibe here.
That's definitely got a Bukowski vibe. Yeah.
That's an interesting. He mentions Lovecraft. We can't get rid of Lovecraft. It seems we can't get rid of Dylan Thomas. Yeah, thanks for that reading, Abbie. I just tried to give you the heavy lifting. It occurs to me we could have done that together like a little play, but let's not discuss that. Yeah. Let's not talk about the war.
Apologies to any Spanish speakers for butchering all the words.
Yeah, indeed. So I have a quote from another writer, Hernan Lavín Cerda, a poet. He was thrown into exile by Pinochet in 1973. He witnessed the infrarealism, and he appeared in an anthology that Bolaño edited and published in Mexico in 1979. Here's what he said about Bolaño during the period. I was 34 when I arrived in Mexico. Roberto was in Chile at the time. He came back to Mexico a little after the coup, but he was much younger than me, barely 20. Yet we had many things in common. Admiration for Nicanor Parra, an appreciation of Neruda's poems in Residencia en la Tierra, plus Jorge Tiller and Enrique Lin. It's so interesting to read these because there's so many author names that I don't know because I'm not really well versed in this literature. It would be very interesting to open that box. What Bolaño did, as I see it, was to bring poetry to the torrent of the novel, and it worked for him. Although I think that if he had had a choice, he would have just written poems his entire life. He was a very agreeable and ironic young man. He could suddenly come out with a sarcastic quip that you never saw coming. I had plenty of pleasant conversations with him and Mario Santiago, and some others that weren't so pleasant. One day he turned up at the door of my house in Coyoacán together with Bruno Montagne. We stood on the threshold, and suddenly, with that mischievous smile that was so typical of him, Roberto took some pages out of his backpack and gave them to me. Bruno was standing behind him looking completely innocent and not saying anything. He said to me, "Take these, Hernan. I want you to read them, and if you agree, you can sign them." I couldn't believe what I was reading. I said to them, "I'm sorry, but I can't sign this document in these terms because it's a kind of manifesto against UNAM." UNAM is the massive national university in Mexico, which would feature in Amulet, a novel that we're going to come to. I came to this country as a political exile, and I've just entered UNAM. Basically, I think that the university respects many different lines of thought. There's a lot of freedom. So Roberto answered me, I see that the poet Larin Cerda has become bourgeois. we didn't see each other
My
again.
God, bourgeois?
For wanting to go to the university, right? As a writer, he's not wrong.
Well,
As a writer, he seems to me a complete writer with a unique strength and power. Well, yeah, there's one other writer, Segovia, and I want to read this. This is interesting. So this is a cafe meeting. I don't really know how it happened, but Bolaño ended up inviting me to come see him speak. The event was at a house in the Roma neighborhood on Calle Colima. I think it was the house where Vera and Mara La Rosa lived. It was something of a Bolaño court. I was met by courtiers who took me to the patio. Then they retired, and I was left on my own with Bolaño. We had a short conversation in which he told me that I should join his movement. It was like joining a political party led by a pope. Come on the podcast. I said no. He answered with a phrase that would be the last thing he ever said to me, because I never spoke to him again. If you're not with me, you're against me. So we're taking poetry a little seriously. We're taking literature.
Oh, yeah.
This is life or death that we're dealing with here for young Roberto Bolaño.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's another quote here that I think is good from the period, and then we'll move forward in the biography. And we're going to get to the novels, and I know Abbie has excerpts that we're going to hear from. So let's see here. I want to give context for who this is. This is Rodrigo Quijada. He was a friend. He was also a poet and writer, occasionally aligned with the infrarealists. That sounds like the most that I would ever be aligned with them myself. We go to their parties. Maybe we swap, go back and forth. But I don't know if I'm ever going to
leave before midnight.
Right. That's weird.
That might be an episode title right there. Brad, can you write that down? Put that in the throw that in. Leave before midnight with Roberto Bolaño. In any case, so Quijada. What I most remember about Bolaño is his enthusiasm, the overwhelming enthusiasm. He was young, spirited, irreverent, and acidic with a great sense of humor. I think that he was destined to stand out at whatever he put his mind to because of that. Bolaño is the epitome of the young man who gets into literature with the certainty that he is going to triumph. He was free of petulance, conventionalism, pedantry, and at the time, he was also a young man in a constant search for love, for promiscuous sexuality. We're going to talk about that on the After Dark, patreon.com/artofdarkpod. I met him when he was just 20 years old, but at that age, Roberto already had his path marked out for him. So his success later with the Savage Detectives wasn't a surprise. I compare him a little to Bukowski, that willingness to explore sordid, dark things, clean them up a little, and then present them to the outside world. So there we go. We're getting a nice portrait of Roberto. So let's push forward to the move to Spain. So he's Chile, Mexico City, the overland trip back to Chile. Some blurry business there. Was he in prison? Was he not? Was he rescued by his friends? Maybe. Now we're back in Mexico and we're angry at the entire world. You're either with me or you're against me. I am in for realism. Manifestos, coffee shops, really deadly serious leftist politics and literature. Very Reddit. We gotta.
Oh my God. I do love Reddit.
Yeah. Twitter. I'm all about the bird website. Or as we call it now, Elon's Journal.
Elon's Journal.
Yeah. So very serious too for someone so young. We're taking the world very seriously and literature very seriously. So moving to Spain. So in 1977, he moved to Europe, made his way to Spain. He settled on the Mediterranean coast near Barcelona, and he worked as a dishwasher campground custodian, bellhop, and garbage collector. So this isn't a guy who gravitates to the big city to go file papers or work in a bank. This is a guy who does working class jobs to sustain himself, real proletariat jobs, so he can just continue to write his poetry. I think we're going to get a hint here about why he maybe turned to writing novels. Oh, boy. So he used his spare time to write, and then from the 80s on, he lived in the small Catalan beach town of Blanes, which I think you could do worse than being a dishwasher.
I was going to say, that sounds all right.
Yeah, on the Mediterranean coast. I'm looking at some pictures of this, and boy, oh boy, it looks pretty idyllic here. As going into May, we haven't even hit spring here in beautiful St. Paul, Minnesota. Maybe when we do Art of Darkness Live, Brad, we will do it in the summer.
Yeah, let's do that in the summer.
Yeah. We're hinting. We want to do an Art of Darkness Live Fitzgerald in St. Paul at some point. So maybe it needs to be in January, Brad. Maybe people need to suffer with us. Yeah. All right. Okay. He continued with his poetry before shifting to fiction in his early 40s. So we're going to flash forward here a bit.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Yeah.
He didn't. Mm-hmm.
I guess I kind of picked that up. It didn't really register for me. Like 40 years old, you're going to start writing fiction. That's crazy.
Well, and we're going to...
And the reasons are even crazier.
Okay.
Yes. Abby, do you care to explain the reasons? Why did Bolaño turn?
So this has always been one of the most wildest and hilarious things about Bolaño whenever I think of him. He decided to move to writing novels so that he could make money for his family, which like as a modern day artist, that's like me saying, short films aren't the one. I should just make feature films. There's more money in that.
Right. What? Yeah.
And the craziest thing is that he was 40 something. He did turn to writing novels, and he made loads of money for his family.
That's amazing.
But it's like, oh yeah, I was a dishwashing poet. Yeah, maybe I'll start writing novels.
That's my get rich. That's my get rich quick scheme. Yeah, just write massive, weird. Well, he didn't start off with a massive novel, but eventually he got there. That's crazy. Yeah, that's the worst. I mean, that's the worst career decision ever, really. But I say that as a novelist. If that's your goal is to make money, do not do this.
That's just get into meme coins or NFTs.
Something.
That's his. But how over the top is that? That's like Kubrick.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just gonna do it.
Yeah. I'm just gonna do it. And maybe we should all just be a little more like Bolaño. I'm just gonna do this to make money for my family.
Obviously, I'm going to pay for my children's education with novels.
Right. In the year 1990.
Yes. Well, so there's a constellation of things that sort of happen around this time. In an interview, he said that he began writing fiction because he felt responsible for the future financial well-being of his family, as Abby said, which he knew he could never secure from the earnings of a poet. Okay. There, little bit of that's not infrarealism. That's just realism.
That's realism. Yeah.
Yeah. This was confirmed by Jorge Geralda, who explained that Bolaño abandoned his parsimonious beatnik existence because the birth of his son in 1990 made him decide that he was responsible for his family's future and that it would be easier to earn a living by writing fiction. However, he continued to think of himself primarily as a poet, and a collection of his verse over 20 years was published in 2000 under the title Los Perros Románticos, The Romantic Dogs. I have a link here to a Dazed digital article called The Strange Things That Bolaño Did.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yes. Yeah. I have, I actually think I have this excerpt somewhere else. But let's see here. Yeah, he was, let's see here. Well, he would go back to Chile after he had some success, and he felt like a little bit of an alien in Chile, which I think is very interesting. He one thing about Bolaño is that he made an impact on the people that he met. There aren't. It seems like everybody has a Bolaño story, which is something I think kind of telling, and maybe goes back to that idea of Bolaño thinking of himself as a bit of a fictional character and sort of creating this this figure. I should mention too that there are some good interviews with him on YouTube. You can go and find them, but none of it is in English, so you got to be prepared for subtitles. But he's clearly a wit and a raconteur, and he's not one of these writers who's totally locked up in himself. And I think it would make sense given that he was this poet moving in these social circles. I have something now from the biography book. Let me find it here. So interesting to think about this move from Chile to Mexico City, now settling in Spain. Very different again. Yeah, this is the article that I was looking at is actually from this book. So that's why I was getting a little confused there. I want to see here. So we're talking about Jaime Rivera, and Rivera studied art at the Faculty of Fine Art in Santiago de Chile. He was an adjunct professor of painting at the School of Fine Arts in the Chilean capital until he had to leave his home country at the request of Pinochet's military junta. Okay.
Yeah.
And so he
They
met
send
Rivera.
you like a postcard? Like, how do they do that?
I think they probably just kill your Twitter account.
Fucking Pinochet.
Yeah. Hey, look, we might get our chance here soon, Brad. Don't worry. We can do this podcast from anywhere. I can do this podcast from the Mediterranean coast.
Yeah, why not? That sounds awesome.
If you want to exile me to the Mediterranean, I will wash.
Yeah, and if we need to make money, I'll just crank out a couple novels.
Yeah, just write some 1,000-page novels.
Sure. We can just podcast harder, Brad.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. He met Roberto in the dark Barcelona of the pre-Olympics period. The city, he says, was very much like the one depicted in the director Bigas Luna in Bilbao, a film from 1978 starring the painter Ángel Jove and the Uruguayan actress Isabel Pisano. Do you know that? Do you know that movie, Bilbao? Never heard of it. In Girona, Roberto made friends with Ángel Jove. He always spoke to me about him and said that he had introduced me to him because he was a very good painter, remembers Jaime. When he got to Barcelona from Mexico, he was very young, very hopeful, and a lot of fun. He came to a friend's house and was charming. He was always a very funny guy. We had similar senses of humor, and so we got on well. During the forced exile of the 1970s in Spain, far from achieving the prosperity that would make it one of the leading countries of Europe in the 90s, solid friendships were forged quickly within a few minutes of the parties meeting. So you have all these Chilean exiles who have made their way to Spain. Spain is not a rich, I suppose you'd say, first world or developed country at the time. It's still being sort of built up. And he goes on here. Jaime Rivera's voice has the tone of shared poverty, the humility of men who don't discuss their dreams of success and fame, perhaps because they don't even dare to dream of them in secret. Rivera, who was also friends with Roberto's mother, because, of course, Roberto's mother was in Spain with his sister as well, which we heard earlier. He thinks that Roberto loved his mother like a dutiful son, but wonders why he didn't leave her more money. We'll get to this, to who Roberto would leave his money to. And we should dispel the myth, too, that 2666 is one novel. It's not. It's 5 novels that ended up being packaged together against his will. We'll talk about that in a bit.
I didn't know that. I mean, I knew there was 5 kind of parts. I didn't know about this. Interesting. Okay.
He conceptualized them. We're getting out of order with this, but that's fine. He conceptualized them as 5 distinct novels, and partly because he knew, and it's actually around this time coming into the 90s in Spain where he discovered that he had this chronic liver ailment. He knew that he wasn't long for the world, and so he wrote them with the hopes that they would be released individually so that they would make maximum return for his children.
Oh, right. Yeah. It's the same. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a dollar per book times 5 versus,
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah. Makes
It
sense.
was only
It was the editor, his editor that he had been with, saw more of a merit to put them together as a whole.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so we have the epic we have today.
Yeah.
I think that they felt that there was some urgency to it, that they wanted to capitalize both on his his early death, but also the fact that the work was of such high quality that why withhold the whole of it for 5 years? Why not just dump it on the world all at once? And I think they made the right decision, but we'll come to that.
Yeah.
So this is again, Jaime. Just want to give a little context for the period in Spain here. Talking about why he didn't leave his mother more money. Those are the kind of things we don't understand about Roberto. He did some very strange things. There were a lot of misunderstandings with Victoria, his mother. Maybe because Roberto had a very macho side. When his mother was in Barcelona, she met a guy who was much younger than her, and they started seeing each other. Roberto couldn't take that. The apartment on Gran Via was very large, and there was a hall. I remember that you had to greet Victoria first and then talk to Roberto. They had burned their bridges. Jaime and Roberto met up in Barcelona a few days before the writer's death. They spoke in a bar for hours. Bolaño drank his usual chamomile tea, and the painter had coffee. Victoria told me that he fell apart in a week. It didn't occur to me that he was going to die. He died suddenly. We'll come to this. It's getting a little out of order with this, but it's important to note that he had a diagnosis when he was 40 of this chronic liver ailment, which was not from heroin. It was not from alcohol. It was an autoimmune disorder. And the ultimate vice that he had, the two vices I think it's fair to say that he had were, well, probably three, were women, cigarettes, and poetry.
Deadly combination.
Yes. And
yeah, that'll kill you.
Yes.
But it's extremely important to think about these last 10 years of his life and the writing of most of these novels as a kind of extraordinary race against time and his own doom, which he was aware of, and especially 2666, which he would be writing almost up until the day that he died.
Wow.
And so the bleakness of that novel, the intensity of that novel, which we'll come to, really can only be understood in the context of a man who is waiting for a liver transplant with the thought that it might never happen. So this is from Rivera. From his point of view, Roberto Bolaño lived ironically. He was full of black humor and especially laughed at himself. Excuse me. We spoke a lot. Very similar things had happened to us. When he was stopped in Chile, he was on a bus from the south. The soldiers made him get off and took him away, and the same thing happened to me. My mother was the head mistress at a school in the south. And when I was on my way to Barcelona, I went to say goodbye, and we were coming back. And as we were coming back, they picked up everyone who was young with long hair. They let me go, but he was imprisoned for a week. So he has these Chilean exile friends in Spain. And now I want to read one more thing from his writing on the concept of exile, because now he is more or less permanently in exile in Spain. This is what he says about exiles. And then we'll turn to the fiction and do our best in a timely way. We're already approaching 90 minutes of this episode, but in a timely way to cover the fiction of Roberto Bolaño, for which
he had just 10 years, and we will have...
We'll go as long as it takes. I don't care how late it is in London. All right, let's see here. So here's what he said about exiles. To be exiled is not to disappear, but to shrink, to slowly or quickly get smaller and smaller until we reach our real height, the true height of the self. Swift, master of exile, knew this. For him, exile was the secret word for journey. Many of the exiled, freighted with more suffering than reasons to leave, would reject this statement. All literature carries exile within it, whether the writer has had to pick up and go at the age of 20 or has never left home. Probably the first exiles on record were Adam and Eve. This is indisputable, and it raises a few questions. Can it be that we're all exiles? Is it possible that all of us are wandering strange lands? The concept of strange lands, like that of home ground, has some holes in it, presents new questions. Are strange lands an objective geographic reality or a mental construct in constant flux? Yeah. This is one more quote about exile. He said, "Exile is courage. True exile is the true measure of each writer." And he would go on to write about Philip K. Dick and Burroughs, and I'd like to think Roberto Bolaño might be an Art of Darkness fan. If he
seems like he's got similar taste.
Philip K. Dick comes up a lot in his work.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Really interesting.
And Borges as well. And we're getting ready to do PKD.
Yeah, we're going to do PKD this summer for sure. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, we're
Well,
already talking about it.
All right. So I think we've laid the table. Here we are. We're in Spain. I believe he turned to writing novels before that diagnosis happened, but it kind of happens in the middle here. I mean, let's try to put it into place. So he moved to Europe in 1977, which would have put him there kind of in his middle 20s. So he had a period in Spain prior to that diagnosis, a number of years actually, 14 or 15 years. So I don't want to give the impression that his turn to fiction totally coincided with that. I want to get a sense of when he began writing. It looks like his first novel was called The Skating Rink. And yeah, it's not entirely clear when he started writing. Obviously, it was published in 1993. Okay. So,
wow. So it really was My Son is Born. I write novels now.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah, for sure.
I wonder what kind of woman his wife is. If she was like, it's time to get your act together.
Yeah.
How about
I write novels?
Yeah.
Okay, Roberto.
Okay, Roberto. Let's see how that goes.
Yeah. That's a great point. We have a little bit of that. And that's because he would pass away in 2003. So if we're talking about 1993, that does kind of coincide with the timeline of his of that diagnosis, because the liver problems, as I understand it, began about 10 years before he passed away. So it's sort of all happening at once. Do we have the date that when his son was born? Was his son born?
It was
in
1990.
Yeah.
1990.
Okay. Yeah. So just enough time to really conceptualize what he had done. This would be a good time for a quote about children. So this is Roberto Bolaño's parenting advice. We will get to the novels here now. So this is from an interview with Eliseo Alvarez, published in Roberto Bolaño's The Last Interview. I suppose that within his brutality and his courage, he is a very courageous man. My father loved me as I loved my son. In the end, one could talk for hours about the relationship between a father and a son. The only clear thing is that a father has to be willing to be spat upon by his son as many times as the son wishes to do it. Even still, the father will not have paid 1/10 of what he owes because the son never asked to be born. If you brought him into this world, the least you can do is put up with whatever insult he wants to offer.
Whoa.
So
I like that.
It's quite intense. Yes, Abby, I figured you would. That's very interesting. And then, okay, so sons didn't ask to be born, but what about daughters? How did Bolaño feel about his daughter? To which he said, I won't say any more. I'll start to cry. The only explanation I could give would be to cry. It's beyond the beyond. So this is a man who felt things very deeply. He was no slouch, and he was not a fraud. The infrarealism and all of that he was a very, very serious writer and an extraordinary writer who felt things very deeply, as we will find as we dig into the novels. So, all right. So although known for his novels and short stories, Bolaño was a prolific poet of free verse and prose poems. He saw himself primarily as a poet. He said, poetry is more than enough for me. It's a character, and a character says in The Savage Detectives, although sooner or later I'm bound to commit the vulgarity of writing stories. Ugh. In rapid succession, he published a series of critically acclaimed works, the most important of which are the novels Los Detectives Salvajes, sorry for my Spanish there, The Savage Detectives, the novello Nocturno de Chile, By Night in Chile, and posthumously the novel 2666. His two collections of short stories, Llamadas Telefónicas and Putas Asesinas. I don't know what that means. Were Putas Asesinas. I don't know what that means. We should look these up. Were awarded literary prizes. So he's winning prizes now with these novels. And in 2009, a number of unpublished novels were discovered among his papers.
He's just winning prizes, making money.
Yeah. Well, he's a good he just put his mind to it,
novels.
Abby.
Yeah.
Just make a feature film.
Yeah.
Yeah. So AbbieLucas.com, we have a number of screenplays and we're very excited about. Putas Asesinas, it means killer whores.
Oh, wow. I didn't know about that one.
Yeah.
I have seen that movie, but
short stories.
I have a book of short stories called The Return by Roberto Bolaño, but not Killer Whores.
Interesting. Where it is worth noting too, Abby, you mentioned earlier you'd listened to the Sarah Kane episode. We're definitely in Gen X, even though he was born in the 50s, right? I guess that makes him a boomer. But his novel writing is very 90s. Really in Tarantino, Sarah Kane, Mike Lee, dark, gritty, violent, sexy, meta deconstruction of the
there's a lot of stuff in his novels that reminds me of Bret Easton Ellis, but perhaps not as superficial. Well, I mean, that was constructed superficiality in Bret Easton Ellis' novels.
Sure. Yeah, it's intentional.
Yeah, the obsessive parts and the tangents and the detail.
Violence.
Yeah. So
the violence.
Llamadas Telefónicas means phone calls. That's all it means. Phone calls and killer horse. Definitely not magical realism. Happening here. We are a long way.
Anti-magical realism.
Yeah, Zabuela was not making
Gabriel Garcia.
Right.
Yeah. It's not about a Zabuela making an enchanted empanada.
No.
Or anything.
The son doesn't ask to be born, Brad. The son doesn't even want your filthy empanada. The sun spits the empanada at you. Woo, Art of Darkness.
Yep, support.
Artofdarkpod.com. All right, so I'm just going to start reading the descriptions of these novels, and when we get to the more significant ones, I know Abby wants to do some excerpts from them. So let me cover The Skating Rink, set in the seaside town of Z on the coast of Brava, north of Barcelona. 3 male narrators, while revolving around a beautiful figure skating champion, Nuria Marti. She suddenly dropped from the Olympic team. A pompous civil servant secretly builds a skating rink in a local ruin of a mansion with public funds. Nuria has affairs, provokes jealousy, and the skating rink becomes a crime scene. I have not read this. That has maybe sounds a little bit like Rashomon. We're using different narrators. We're playing with the politics of the Olympics. There's a civil servant. There's corruption. That sounds like a good read to me. It sounds like we're coming out of the gates with a sense of structure and of maybe kind of fable is in play here. You know, different narrators, and then this figure of this figure skater. Yeah, then the next novel I know a little better because I watched some YouTube content on this. There's some pretty good English language Bolaño content. It's a lot of guys with funny hair and beards who do who do these like book reviews where they go, today I'm going to read 2666 and we're going to read part 3, the part about the murders or whatever it is, right? And they do their 15 or 20 minutes, and some are better than others. Some are actually quite good. You can find these online. There's also yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say it's funny because the podcasts I've listened to, which were not YouTube videos, they were more like, there is no plot to this novel. I put it down. I am not reading any more of it.
What, 2666?
No, I think that was the Savage Detectives.
Yes. Oh, the Savage Detectives is just a road story. It's just a whatever. They didn't get it. They didn't get it. Well, that's okay. It's not for everybody.
It wasn't for them.
No, it was not for them. There is some good content though, and you can also find on YouTube the whole of the Savage Detectives as an audiobook, and I think 2666. They're pretty easy to find. So if you're the type who listens to podcasts and maybe isn't the biggest reader, you can also get some of this stuff here. I would really recommend the audiobook for the Savage Detectives. It's very funny. That book, I forgot how humorous it is. In any case, the next novel is called Nazi Literature in the Americas. And this is such an interesting example of a book. It's not even really appropriate to call it a novel. It is an entirely fictitious, ironic encyclopedia of fascist Latin American and American writers and critics who are all blinded to their own mediocrity and sparse readership by passionate self-mythification.
Oh, that's awesome.
That's
what a cool idea.
That sounds like NRX Twitter.
Yeah, a little bit. It does.
Well, apparently Bolano was obsessed with lists, so
sounds right.
The list as a novel.
Yeah.
Right.
Why not?
And it's so funny, and it's like, so this is a risk that literature generally runs in his work. The characters, they all have heinous philosophy, so political philosophy. And it was published in 1996. So he's publishing these novels pretty straight away. I imagine he leveraged his clout as a poet and his background to probably get these published. It probably didn't hurt that he had a background. The events of the book take place from the late 19th century up to 2029. And then the last portrait he expanded into the novel Distant Star, which I believe is the first novel that really did anything like anything substantial for him. Is that fair to say, Abby? I think this one, I think it might have won a prize, or it. I
think some people have sort of described it as like his kind of perfect, novella, I guess. Like there's something I'd read about how Roberto Bolaño's novellas are sort of like a perfect work, like very considered and well done. And the bigger novels like the Savage Detectives of 2666 have got this more like notebook type of quality to them. They're kind of a little more rough around the edges. Yeah,
I read Distant Star and I recall liking it quite a lot. I love the title. It's a novella nested in the politics of the Pinochet regime, concerned with murder, photography, and poetry blazed across the sky by the smoke of Air Force planes. So there's this pilot who writes poems in the sky in Chile, which is quite a interesting vision. This dark satirical work deals with the history of Chilean politics in a morbid and sometimes humorous fashion. And it sounds like, Abby, you're going to read a little bit of Distant Star for us.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to start with the preface, actually, because I think I don't know if I'm correct, but I think this is the first instance in which we hear from Arturo Bolano, who's going to pop up a lot in Bolaño's works. The preface for this book says, in the final chapter of my novel, Nazi Literature in the Americas, I recounted in less than 20 pages and perhaps too schematically, the story of Lieutenant Ramirez Hoffman of the Chilean Air Force, which I heard from a fellow Chilean, Arturo B., a veteran of Latin America's doomed revolutions, who tried to get himself killed in Africa. He was not satisfied with my version. It was meant to counterbalance the preceding excursions into the literary grotesque, or perhaps to come as an anticlimax, and Arturo would have preferred a longer story that, rather than mirroring or exploding others, was in itself a mirror and an explosion. So we took that final chapter and shut ourselves up for a month and a half in my house in Blanes, where, guided by his dreams and nightmares, we composed the present novel. My role was limited to preparing refreshments, consulting a few books, and discussing the reuse of numerous paragraphs with Arturo and the increasingly animated ghosts of Pierre Menard. So Arturo, his literary alter ego, popped up to tell him to write Distant Star as a full novel, novella. And it's an interesting story because the narrator of the story is never really identified. So, I mean, he's a character who's been exiled to Spain. You could probably argue that it's Bolaño himself. And they start out talking about this. Again, it's like poetry as heroes, which is going to come up a lot. They start out talking about this guy in this poetry workshop named Alberto Ruiz Tagle. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. That the narrator and his friend Bibiano are jealous for some reason. He's this. They're at pains to describe him as an autodidact, and he's sort of popular with like the women in the class. So, like, not a particularly good poet, popular with the women in the class, and somebody that they talk about a lot. There's a lot of like gossip in this novella, and then the military coup happens, and this poet resurfaces as a military pilot called Carlos Huida, who skywrites poetry in the sky with a plane that's like mostly based off Bible verses. And he becomes this kind of like state-sponsored celebrity poet, but also potentially a serial killer.
Well,
and
I remember that. It's so so bizarre. Yeah, fascinating.
And there was an excerpt that I'd read from this Jaime Rivera character who Kevin had mentioned earlier, who is a Chilean painter, and Rivera had told Roberto Bolaño about a fascist painter in Chile who'd had an exhibition in his apartment of all these paintings of like murders that were fictitious murders, but in the book Distant Star, this Carlos Huida character exhibits a bunch of photographs to like the kind of military and political elite of these murders that he's supposedly committed, and all of this is told by this character who's in Spain, who's only like hearing secondhand accounts of these things because during the coup he went into exile. And there's one section that I wanted to read, because one of the things I quite like about Roberto Bolaño's writing is his like tendency to go off on a complete tangent and then just like describe a character who's arrived out of nowhere.
And he goes harder and longer, and his paragraphs will go on for pages.
Yeah,
he does not care.
He does not care, and it's
the thought continues.
And this is the characters will just be fully formed people who have been born into the world, you know. And you know, getting into the longer novels, we'll see that he can juggle up to like 50 or 60 characters. But so this narrator is talking about how his friend Bibiano Orion has been sort of like obsessed with and trying to keep up with this Huida character. And so it goes, Bibiano's investigations in the United States were not, however, limited to the world of board games. So Bibiano had noticed a couple of board games on the market that he thought Carlos Huida had something to do with. I heard from a friend, though I don't know if the story is true, that Bibbiano contacted a member of the Philip K. Dick Society in Glen Ellen, California, who was, for want of a better expression, a collector of literary curiosities. Apparently, Bibbiano entered into correspondence with this individual who specialized in secret messages in literature, painting, theater, and cinema, and told him the story of Carlos Ouida. A specimen of that sort, the collector reckoned, was bound to wash up sooner or later in the United States. Bibbiano's correspondent was called Graham Greenwood, and like a true North American, he had a firm and militant belief in the existence of evil, absolute evil. In his personal theology, hell was a framework or a chain of coincidences. He explained serial killings as explosions of chance. He explained the death of the innocent and everything our minds refuse to accept as the expression of chance set free. Fortune and luck, he said, are the names of the devil's house. He appeared on local television stations and spoke on community radio up and down the West Coast, as well as in New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas, promulgating his vision of the crime. The way to fight evil, he said, was to learn how to read, and by this he meant not only words, but numbers, colors, signs, arrangements of tiny objects, late night and early morning television shows, obscure films. He did not, however, believe in revenge. He was opposed to the death penalty and in favor of radical prison reform. He always carried a gun and defended his citizens' right to do so as the only way to prevent the rise of a fascist state. He did not limit the fight against evil to the planet Earth, which in some of his cosmological rants resembled a penal colony. In space, he said, there are liberated zones where chance cannot penetrate, and the only source of pain is memory. Which is an interesting sort of take on America.
No, that's awesome. That's awesome. There's some burrows in there. There's some William S. Burroughs in there for sure. But that was fantastic.
I have an excerpt from him that I want to throw in right now, which is him talking about American writers. And this is something that it's sort of extremely important that we mention. There's a lot of colonial anxiety in Latin American letters, and there's a lot of pondering that happened about Bolaño's career in the Anglosphere after his death, and what it really means to have these works translated into English and then gobbled up by every college student in the West, in the UK and in the United States, and the hype around it and what it really means, of course, because anytime anything like this blows up this big, there's always going to be people who kind of wrinkle their nose and go, well, this clearly can't be authentic. But that's so interesting, Abby, because of course he's using that character as a metaphor for the whole of the American project in South America. And what a wonderful metaphor this skywriting serial killer that does sound rather American, doesn't it? So here's something from some of his journalistic writings. Brad, you're going to appreciate this. Our Guide to the Abyss. All American novelists, including those who write in Spanish, at some point get a glimpse of two books looming on the horizon. These books represent two paths, two structures, and above all, two plots, even sometimes two fates. One is Moby Dick. The other is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The first is the key to those realms that by convention or for the sake of convenience we call the realms of evil. Those places where man struggles with himself and with the unknown and is generally defeated in the end. The second is the key to adventure and happiness, a lesser-known land, modest and unassuming, in which the character or characters set the quotidian in motion, start it rolling, and the results are unpredictable and, at the same time, recognizable and close at hand. I just think that's interesting as a sort of take on American writers. Here's a little bit of it. And he's talking about himself, too. He means the whole of the Americas.
Yeah.
He's not talking about the United States. All American writers drink of these two galloping streams. All of us search these two forests, each looking for his own lost face. courage, daring, the bliss of he who has nothing to lose, or he who has much to lose, but whose generosity or madness impels him to risk everything with an elegance that has nothing to do with European elegance, that is, with European perspectives or European literary forms. These are the attributes of men who are now American through and through, an impossibility, no matter how you look at it, an act of the will, an entelechy that neither Melville nor Twain consciously constructs, at least not the latter, but which is automatically set up by the hunting of the whale from that terrible ship full of men of every stripe, and by that meandering voyage down the Mississippi. Here we have the founding fathers, from Homer to Whitman, and from Whitman to the plight of a slave and the madness of a whaling captain. No transition, no method in the manner of this new and untamed world. This is a man who thought deeply about literature. It's no wonder that he succeeded.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, he was no slouch. There's a quote I have here somewhere. He said he was happier reading than writing.
Yeah, apparently he just read everything. Didn't matter what language it was,
Yeah. Well, let's press on and try to cover the bases here, because we're going to get to the heavy work. That was great,
yes.
Abby. Yes, that was so much fun. Well, this brings us to the Savage Detectives,
which apparently was also described as his Huckleberry Finn.
I was going to say, yeah, you could, if based on what he just said, yes, it's the Huckleberry Finn road story, whereas 2666 would be Moby Dick. You're chasing the Archamboldi, the great whale. You're chasing the horror of violence in the 20th century is the whale that he's chasing. So let's see. There's some quotes about this. This was a major book when this came out. There's a literary editor who said, Ignacio Echevarria said, this is the novel that Borges would have written, which is high praise. Saying Bolaño's genius is not just the extraordinary quality of his writing, but also that he does not conform to the paradigm of the Latin American writer. His writing is neither magical realism, nor Baroque, nor localist, but an imaginary extraterritorial mirror of Latin America, more as a kind of state of mind than a specific place. So, Abby, tell us about the Savage Detectives.
Okay. Yeah. So it's, as you said, it's been described as post-magical realism. I guess it's, yeah. Well, it's also like real in that it's autobiographical. It's about these two poets who basically go on a road trip. You've got Arturo Belano, which is Roberto Bolaño, and then Ulysses Lima, who is the alter ego of his friend Mario Santiago, who he founded Inforealism with. But the minor poetry movement in the Savage Detectives is called the Visceral Realists. And yeah, or just maybe a better name, who knows. But it's a book that's in a rather large book, but it's in three parts, and we start with the diary of a young new visceral realist called Juan Garcia Madero, who's he's 17. He's a little green. He's living with I think an aunt and uncle, and he wants to study literature, but they've told him he needs to study law, so he's gone to the university to become a lawyer. But there's an excerpt that is on the very first page of the book, which I think really pokes at how it's I think it's Bolaño poking at his sort of hindsight of the infrarealist movement, because it's sort of poking fun at the visceral realists. So it starts with November 2. I've been cordially invited to join the visceral realists. I accepted, of course. There is no initiation ceremony. It was better that way. November 3. I'm not really sure what visceral realism is. I'm 17 years old. My name is Juan Garcia Madero, and I'm in my first semester of law school. I wanted to study literature, not law, but my uncle insisted, and in the end, I gave in. I'm an orphan, and someday I'll be a lawyer. That's what I told my aunt and uncle, and then I shut myself in my room and cried all night. Or anyway, for a long time. Then, as if it was settled, I started class in the law school's hallowed halls, but a month later, I registered for Julio Cesar Almo's poetry workshop in the literature department. And that's how I met the visceral realists, or visceralists, or even visceral realists, as they sometimes like to call themselves. And then it goes on a little bit further where he sort of describes one of these these battles that the visceral realists do with other poets. He says, I'm not sure why they were there. It was clearly a hostile visit. Hostile, but somehow propagandistic and proselytizing too. At first, the visceral realists kept to themselves, and Almo tried to look diplomatic and slightly ironic while he waited to see what would happen. Then he started to relax, encouraged by the stranger's shyness, and after half an hour, the workshop was back to normal. That's when the battle began. The visceral realists questioned Almo's critical system, and he responded by calling them cut-rate surrealists and fake Marxists. 5 members of the workshop backed him up. In other words, everyone but me and a skinny kid who always carried around a book by Lewis Carroll and never spoke. This surprised me, to be honest, because the students supporting Almo so fiercely were the same ones he'd been so hard on as a critic, and now they were revealing themselves to be his biggest supporters. That's when I decided to put in my 2 cents, and I accused Almo of having no idea what a respeto was. Nobly, the visceral realists admitted that they didn't know either, but my observation struck them as pertinent. And they said so. One of them asked how old I was, and I said I was 17 and tried all over again to explain what a respeto was. Almo was red with rage. All the members of the workshop said I was being pedantic. One of them called me an academicist. The visceral realist defended me, suddenly unstoppable. I asked Almo and the workshop in general whether they at least remembered what a Nicarchian or a stick was the poetry terms, no one could answer. So we've got this kid who's 17 and he knows more about the form of poetry than his poetry workshop professor or any of the visceral realists know. And he continues to be pedantic about these things throughout the book. Nice. But it's so we've got his in the first part, it's all from this perspective of this young new visceral realist who's meeting all the members of the visceral realism gang, including Attila Bolano and Ulysses Lima, but I mean, more personally, it's sort of a sexual awakening for him. There's women that he's sleeping with, and I mean, a lot of people say that Bolaño's work is full of a lot of sex. I mean, like when I read it, I'm not struck by it overly being sexual, but I guess there's a lot of sex in it.
I mean, if you're reflecting life, you'd like to think that it's a fixture of life and a big deal. It's an important part of life. Yeah.
So the first part is this kid's perspective, and it comes up to a pertinent part of the book where he leaves Mexico City with Bolano and Ulysses Lima to help a woman escape, a young prostitute escape her pimp, essentially, and they take off. And then suddenly we're thrust into part 2, which spans 1976 to 1996, and it's a bunch of first-hand accounts of people and their encounters and experiences of Attila Bolano and Ulysses Lima, spanning Mexico City, Israel, Paris, Spain, a bit in Africa, which is interesting because in that preface that we read in Distant Star, it talks about Attila Bolano trying to die in Africa, and that is a section of the Savage Detectives. So all of these threads, he's been thinking about different works that he's got going on for a long time, because these characters do keep coming up in all of these different works. But there's part two. I mean, it's almost as if there is a detective interviewing all of these people to find out more about these two vagabond poets, but you're never given a sense of who this person collecting these first-hand accounts might be, which is interesting. And I've never read anything that has a theory on who or what that might be, that wants to learn about these two poets. I mean, as some people say, like, complete lack of plot, other than that we're following them through, like, there's the one of the Tirabellino ends up going back to Chile. We've got all of these things happening, but there's this section that I'd like to look at in sort of around chapter 23, which occurs in Europe, and sort of goes into this. Tirabellino is going to publish some work of his, and gets the sense that a critic might rip him apart. So he challenges him to a duel on a nudist beach with, like, actual swords.
What?
Which is like, poet is the hero, like, defending literature to the death, like all of this sort of stuff. So he challenges this critic to a duel, and the critic accepts, and you get the sort of, like, first-hand accounts from the critic's second, from Bolano's second, but then there's this interesting sort of, like, literary framework that he does in chapter 23. So this is an excerpt from the critic after the duel has happened. And each section in this part two is headed up with who is speaking and where they're speaking and when they're speaking. So, Eneki Ekavane ba Giardineto, Calle Granada del Penedès, Barcelona, July 1994. For a while, criticism travels side by side with the work. Then criticism vanishes, and it's the readers who keep pace. The journey may be long or short. Then the readers die one by one, and the work continues on alone. Although a new criticism and new readers gradually fall into step with it along its path. Then criticism dies again, and the readers die again, and the work passes over a trail of bones on its journey towards solitude. To come near the work, to sail in her wake, is a sign of certain death. But new criticism and new readers approach her tirelessly and relentlessly, and are devoured by time and speed. Finally, the work journeys irredeemably alone in the great vastness, and one day the work dies, as all things must die and come to an end. The sun and the earth and the solar system and the galaxy, and the farthest reaches of man's memory. Everything that begins as a comedy ends as a tragedy. Which is a lovely sort of passage about the continuance of work, be it film or literature or poetry or whatever it is. But each person in this chapter, at the end of their paragraphs, has something to say about comedy. So it starts with that guy saying everything that begins as comedy ends as tragedy. The next one says everything that begins as comedy ends as a tragicomedy. The next one, everything that begins as comedy inevitably ends as a comedy.
Huh.
And then everything that begins as comedy ends as a cryptographic exercise. It continues. Everything that begins as comedy ends as a horror movie.
Whoa.
What begins as comedy ends as a triumphal march, wouldn't you say?
So it's a list.
It's like,
is it a list?
So these are all happening after each person's account of when they've met Arturo Bolano, Ulysses Lima, or like something that they're just sort of thinking or feeling at the time that they knew them. But it was, I just thought it was so interesting to go from, Bolano challenging this guy to a duel, and then he had, this character had such a profound thing to say about the continuation of work. And when you read the passage, work is a capital W, criticisms a capital C, and readers are a capital R. Yeah, and I mean, there's, I think I read there are like 54 characters that are in this book talking about these poets, and every one of them has like a very clear voice, which is like a crazy achievement.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And then you get to the third part of the book, which goes back to Juan Garcia Madero, but he's with Bolano and Ulysses Lima. Presumably, we're back in the year that we were originally, which I think was 1975. And as well as trying to escape this pimp, they've gone into the Sonora Desert, which will come up in 2666, to find a woman named Cesaria Tinajero, who is reportedly the grandmother of visceral realism. She was like born in the 1920s, and the poems that she wrote were like squiggles. They're not actual poems. They're squiggles, and you can buy these as t-shirts on Redbubble.
Was she a real person?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so that's the plot of the third part of the book.
Wow.
And yeah, this book is wild. It's a road movie. It's funny. It's nostalgia. Like
it has whores in it. It has sex. Yep. There's a great long passage where one of I think the older poets describes the breakdown of the different kind of homosexual poets and how all poetry is queer, and it's just a different range of it, but it's all very comic. And he just describes all these different poets and how one's a fairy, but the other's butch and the other's this, and it just goes on. And you go,
and I was going to say, you've got these people that like revere these two like founders of visceral realism or whatever, and then there's others who are like, nah man, they were just some drug dealers, like they barely ever wrote poetry.
Right. It's like the poetry is like a cover. It's like SoundCloud rappers with 80 listens who really, they just sling Adderall or whatever it is. I have two things I want to read, and then I think we can move forward in the canon here if you're comfortable with that, Abby. Definitely check out The Savage Detectives. This put them on the map in a really, really big way. This was quite popular and kind of a generational novel when it came out. This is a quote that was written after he passed this was written after he passed, Stacey DeRosmo, the New York Times Book Review. This is written in 2008. Among the many acid pleasures of the work of Roberto Bolaño is the idea that culture, in particular literary culture, is a whore. In the face of political repression, upheaval, and danger, writers continue to swoon over the written word, and this, for Bolaño, is the source both of nobility and of pitch black humor. In his novel, The Savage Detectives, two avid young Latino poets never lose faith in their rarefied art, no matter the vicissitudes of life, age, and politics. If they are sometimes ridiculous, they are always heroic. But what can it mean, he asks us and himself in his dark, extraordinary, stinging novella By Night in Chile, which we'll come to, that the intellectual elite can write poetry, paint, and discuss the finer points of avant-garde theater as the junta tortures people in basements. The word has no national loyalty, no fundamental political bent. It's a genie that can be summoned by any would-be master. Part of Bolaño's genius is to ask us via ironies so sharp you can cut your hands on his pages, if we perhaps find a too easy comfort in art, if we use it as anesthetic, excuse and hideout in a world that is very busy doing very real things to very real human beings. Is it courageous to read Plato during a military coup, or is it something else? So he's sort of at war with literature as he's making literature. I also have a list, which he loved. And this is from the final interview, the Playboy Mexico interview from 2002. We'll read a little more from this too, closer to the end of this episode. Before we do the After Dark, where we're going to focus on some of his love affairs, which you'll be able to hear if you get to the Patreon, patreon.com/artofdarkpod. So he was asked to send in a list of 10. And see, I only read Playboy for the lists. I only read Playboy Mexico. Bolaño being Bolaño, he chose not to conform to the pre-established format. They wanted 10. He sent 16. Here's his list of the books: Don Quixote, Moby Dick, The Complete Works of Borges, Hopscotch by Julio Cortázar, A Confederacy of Dunces, which is an interesting pick, Nadia by André Breton, War Letters by Jacques Vacher, The Ubu Plays, so some theater in there, by Alfred Jarry, Life, A User's Manual, George Perec, The Castle and the Trial, Kafka, Aphorisms, Lichtenberg, Tractatus Logico Philosophicus by Wittgenstein, which is quite a pick. It's a bit out of left field. We'll read the Tractatus, little light reading. The Invention of Moral by Casares, the Satyricon, which I think is a great pick, Petronius, The History of Rome, Livy, and Thoughts by Pascal. Very interesting list.
That is an interesting list.
Who knows what was behind his choices there?
Yeah.
He was being cheeky, difficult, but you could do a lot worse than to start there as a reading list, along with maybe some old editions of Playboy Mexico. All right. Well, so yeah, The Savage Detectives, it's such a delightful read. It's just a fun read. And if you don't read anything else, maybe read Distant Star, read Savage Detectives. We'll come to 2666. That's the white whale. But don't be daunted by The Savage Detectives. It's hilarious. For anybody who's ever been young and pretentious, or you've been around young, pretentious people,
it was funny. It was funny for me because Savage Detectives was the first Bolaño novel that I read, and I read it when I was young and pretentious. And now reading it again, like sort of 10 years later, it's a completely different experience. And I feel like I maybe have gone through a similar experience to what Bolaño had. That, you know, when I was reading it back then, it was kind of like, oh yeah, like these, you know, these like revolutionaries, they're like doing this and that or whatever. And now it's kind of like, oh yeah, these are like pretentious, annoying idiots.
A decade goes by and you're like, oh, he was making fun of them. Yeah. Oh, shoot.
Yeah. But able to also look back on them with like the funness of, I was that.
I want to read a little bit of his poetry that I had here. Just because I want to remember that he's a poet first as we move along. So this is from a collection of poetry, Trace, which came out. I'll just read a few of these. I dreamt that Earth was finished, and the only human being to contemplate the end was Franz Kafka. In heaven, the Titans were fighting to the death. From a wrought iron seat in Central Park, Kafka was watching the world burn. I dreamt I was dreaming and I came home too late. In my bed, I found Mario Desa Carniero sleeping with my first love. When I uncovered them, I found they were dead, and, biting my lips till they bled, I went back to the streets. I dreamt that Anacreon was building his castle on the top of a barren hill and then destroying it. I dreamt I was a really old Latin American detective. I lived in New York, and Mark Twain was hiring me to save the life of someone without a face. It's going to be a damn tough case, Mr. Twain, I told him. Just so interesting.
Wow. Yeah,
and so
those are really
concerned with
evocative.
literature and writing and writers. And well, so the next novel, and we've got a few more to go until we get to the biggie. The next novel is called Amulet, and Amulet is set during some unrest at UNAM, which is the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, which is it's just the big, university in Mexico City. Massive, massive campus. It takes up like an entire district. And it happens over 2 weeks while the army storms the school. A young woman gets locked in a bathroom. She's trapped there while this happens. And yeah, this is called Amulet. And this is the novel where the meaning of 2666 is hinted at. So, Abby, I know you have some context for us here.
Yeah. So the story was one of the accounts in Savage Detectives originally, and then got blown out into a full novella, I guess, the same way Nazi literature in America got blown out into Distant Star. So we've got this woman, again, I apologize for my pronunciation, Auxilio La Couture. She refers to herself as the mother of all Mexican poets and a friend to all of them. And I haven't read this book for a very long time, but she is trapped in this bathroom, and the stories are sort of like a hallucinatory account of her dealings with these poets. And so I have an excerpt here where she talks about Arturo Bolano. Again, he's popped up, and she's talking about when he comes back from Chile after the Pinochet uprising. So again, we can assume that this is Roberto Bolaño either recounting his own experiences or building up that mythology that he's been building. So it goes like this. For the first few days after returning, Arturo stayed at home, hardly setting foot outside, and for everyone but me, it was as if he still hadn't come back from Chile. But I went to his apartment and talked to him and found out that he'd been imprisoned for 8 days, and although he hadn't been tortured, he'd acquitted himself bravely. And I told his friends, I said, Arturito's back, and I painted his return with colors borrowed from the palette of epic poetry. And when one night Arturito finally appeared in the Café Quito on the Avenida Bucareli, his old friends, the young poets, saw him in a different light. Why? Well, because for them, Arturito now belonged to the category of those who have seen death at close range, and the subcategory of hard men. And that, in the eyes of those desperate Latin American kids, was a qualification that commanded respect, a veritable compendium of medals. So, yeah, whether Bolano was treated differently when he came back from Chile or not is an interesting thing to ponder. But in this same novel, they also hint at 2660, the title 2666, and where that possibly may come from. Just going to find that for you.
Yes, yeah. I believe that it has something to do with a grave or a graveyard that occurs in like a vision in Amulet. And I think that, go ahead, Abby.
So she talks about how one night she follows Bolano and Ernesto San Epifanio on a walk where they're going in search of the so-called King of the Rent Boys. And in the book, she says, I followed them. I saw them go down Bucareli to Reforma with a spring in their step, and then cross Reforma without waiting for the lights to change. Their long hair blowing in the excess wind that funnels down Reforma at that hour of the night, turning into a transparent tube or an elongated lung, exhaling the city's imaginary breath. Then we walked down the Avenida Guerrero, where they weren't stepping so lightly anymore. And I wasn't feeling too enthusiastic either. Guerrero at that time of night is more like a cemetery than an avenue. Not a cemetery in 1974 or in 1968 or 1975, but a cemetery in the year 2666, a forgotten cemetery under the eyelid of a corpse or an unborn child, bathed in the dispassionate fluids of an eye that tried so hard to forget one particular thing that it ended up forgetting everything else.
Wow. Okay. I love that
the
passage.
Vision of a city of Mexico City and this particular street being a cemetery from the future is staggering in terms of metaphor.
Well, in 2666, at least one of the parts is a cemetery of is it
women,
300-page cemetery of women. So
indeed,
yeah.
And we will come to this shortly because you don't want to miss that. Stay with us here on Art of Darkness.
You've been here this long.
We are well into the third hour, and we appreciate our listeners. We love to drop you into the casket and carry you with us to the morgue on this show.
Bury you in the cemetery of the year 2666.
We don't go out of our way to do it. It's just this is the reality of a writer like this. It's dark, isn't it? Leave before midnight with Abby, Brad, and Kevin.
I don't know if I'll be doing that.
No, you're stuck. It's going to be a late one for you. That is fine. And I just want to remind people we have a Telegram channel. All the links are on the website. We are starting to get a lot of, I hate the word engagement. We're starting to hear from people, and people tell us who they want us to do. They tell us they want more Lovecraft. Brad says, Kevin, we should make multi-part episodes. Kevin says, that's more work for me because I have to do the post and then someone on Twitter says that should have been a multi-part episode, and Kevin cries. But we do take your feedback, and we want to hear from you. We want to hear who you want us to do. If we miss something in an episode, we want to know. And when it comes to the format of this show, too, the show is loose enough that there's nothing stopping us from doing a Lovecraft part two.
No,
right?
Not at all.
Or doing
the whole
the
Dark Room episodes kind of started we were trying to figure out an excuse to get some people on that we wanted to have on. And and
this is just a joy for me. Two of my favorite people here, and we just get to talk about
great. Just talk about Bolaño.
Lunatic poet.
I'm learning so much. I mean, 2666 was one of those books I read and I put down, and I was like, I don't even know what to make of that. Like, blew my mind. I loved every minute of it, but at the end, I was like, I don't even know what that was exactly. Yeah,
you'll never want for a doorstop.
No.
That is a substantial novel. I remember when I read that, and it was pretty staggering. It influenced me too. That play that I wrote, Coyote, was really influenced by it. Very interesting. Very heavy. All right, so let's see here. Moving along, we have By Night in Chile, which is this is a great read. We're not going to read anything from it, but you should consider reading this. It's a narrative constructed from the loose deathbed rantings of an Opus Dei priest and failed poet. At a crucial point in his career, he's approached by two agents of Opus Dei. Opus Dei is like the CIA of the Vatican. It's like their elite kind of whatever. Doesn't it figure in those silly, what are those novels called? The Da Vinci Code, right?
Yeah, it's a big part of the Da Vinci Code, actually.
Yeah. He's, I'm pretty sure By Night in Chile is not like the Da Vinci Code. They inform him that he's been chosen to visit Europe to study the preservation of old churches, which is perfect for him. On his arrival, he's told that the major threat to European cathedrals is pigeon droppings, and that his old world counterparts have devised a clever solution. They become falconers. And in town after town, he watches the priests' hawks viciously dispatch flocks of harmless birds. The Jesuits' failure to protest against this bloody means of architectural preservation signals to his employers that he will serve as a passive accomplice to the predatory and brutal methods of the Pinochet regime. And so this is where Bolaño begins to really indict intellectuals who retreat into art and fail morally in the real world. So this is quite an intense novel about the Pinochet regime, Chile, and it represents his views upon returning to Chile and finding a haven for the evil that he saw in the regime, the consolidation of the power structures and human rights violations and all the rest. The book was originally going to be called Tormenta de Mierda, shitstorm in English.
Nice.
But his friends convinced him to change the name. So instead it's By Night in Chile.
Okay.
Although I was listening to a podcast where apparently that translation might not be correct because the Nocturno in Nocturno de Chile might mean something different than By Night.
I wonder what would it mean.
I don't remember, which is not coming with the punchline.
That's okay. Well, it just says nocturno means night, but I wonder, it could
But I think there is an alternate meaning for nocturno,
right.
Whether it be like not slang, but the name for something else.
Sure. Yeah, he's that kind of writer where the things are going to have two or three meanings, and in reading in English, some of it's going to get lost. If anybody knows, find us. We're on the Bird website. We're on Elon's journal at Art of Dark Pod. Okay, great. So the next novel, before we get to 2666, I just want to cover it. It's called Antwerp. I don't know this.
I don't know this either.
Yeah, his literary executor, Ignacio Echevarria, says Antwerp is the big bang of his universe. It's a loose prose poem novel. It was written in 1980 when he was 27. It remained unpublished until 2002. It was published in Spanish as Amberes a year before the author's death. It contains a loose narrative structure, less around a story arc and more around motifs, reappearing characters and anecdotes. These are themes that would be common material for him, right? Crimes, campgrounds, drifters, poetry, sex, love, corrupt cops, misfits. Of this novel, Bolaño said, it's the only novel that doesn't embarrass me. Is on.
Oh, wow.
So might be worth checking out. Wrote it when he was 27. Yeah. So
is that maybe because he thinks stories are vulgar and this loose prose poem novel is like more his jam?
I think that might be the case. Yeah, that might be it. Yeah, he's a funny guy. But that is that thing, right? Where you think even about the Savage Detectives and how it's just this middle-aged poet looking back and cringing at his own youth. Which
cringing and like romanticizing and cringing at the same time.
Yeah. I think we are all of an age where we've probably put our heads on the pillow at night and sort of thought about things and said, "Oh boy, let's not do that again." Yeah, every single night, right? Because that's when the carnival starts. Head on the pillow. Ah, boy. All right.
Alexa, play sleep sounds.
Yeah, indeed. So we've arrived at the big one, and I want to leave enough air for this so that we can really sort of get at it. But before we do, I want to talk a bit about his liver and his health situation, which was affecting him as he wrote this. Let me make sure I find it. So let's see. Here's a friend of his talking about his Roberto's attitude toward death. This is so intense. I don't know whether he expected to die soon, and I also don't know whether all that grotesque, clownish talk about his imminent death with his friends was a form of exorcism, as though if he talked about it a lot, it wouldn't happen. Writers have those tics, a little savant, a little dumb, but there was something about him that felt that he was writing against something as fast as possible. I don't know if he thought faster than he could physically write, and was thus always competing with himself against the ideas of a gigantic brain. I don't know. 10 years before Roberto died, he had his first hepatic attack that almost killed him. And he was certain that if he went back into hospital, he would die, which was true in the end. I said to him, Roberto, stop screwing around. Sign the forms just to see what happens. They make medical advances every day. But he refused. Also, Roberto liked Philip K. Dick a lot and had a very Philip K. Dickian suspicion that he had died during the first liver attack, and that everything that had happened to him in the subsequent 10 years was the life that he hadn't been able to experience in reality. I said to him that it was a little unpleasant of him to say things like that because they meant that I was just a character of his, that we're all just his fantasies. He replied, well, Rodrigo, it's better than being one of Isabel Allende's characters. There are worse fates.
Jeez.
That's so funny.
Wow.
I mean, I guess if you think you're dead, like, yeah, why not become a novelist for money?
Yeah.
What a moving and sad passage.
Yeah.
That really made me quite sad.
Wow.
And of course that coincides with his having children.
Yeah.
I want to read a couple more things here before we get into 2666. That kind of I kind of want to put him in time here. Now, it's worth noting, by the time he really digs into 2666, he's had success. The Savage Detectives has made him, I don't know if we would say,
well, in Latin America.
Yes, right. Yeah.
In the Spanish language, I mean.
Yeah. In the Spanish-speaking world, he's a known writer with a very wildly successful novel with the Savage Detectives. He's won pretty big prizes. His friends resent him a little bit in Mexico. He's done the job.
He's got haters.
He's got haters. Hey, man, you know what? So this is his friend. The supposedly unwritten ending of 2666 apparently had something to do with posterity, and then Arturo Bolaño converted into a kind of super being, transmitting the entirety of 2666 a la Kubrick, like a kind of floating fetus in a space station. One thing I do remember happened in a bar on the corner of the street where he lived. It was one of the last times we spoke. There was another friend there who became his friend too, Alfredo Garofano, who's a paparazzo. He started to think about the future and fantasized about the idea of living in a time when he could transcend his own body and be attached to a metallic structure. My body is screwed, he said. And he also said how happy he would be inside a Terminator-style shell, writing from within a casing that made him immortal. He did know a lot about cinema, and hang on. So let's see here. This is a funny anecdote. During the 4 stations we shared, he decided to describe a film version of Dante's Divine Comedy in detail. He told us about scenes, camera angles, etc. I said to him, Roberto, that film doesn't exist. His reply was, Rodrigo, I've seen it. He spoke about the director, the actors. Of course, when I got home, I looked for it, and it did indeed exist. Also, you couldn't get copies of the film anymore, and it was only shown on television. That was more unsettling than if he had made the whole thing up. And one more final anecdote before we get into the big novel is about his taste in music. And I think this is funny to remember. He's this provincial kid from Chile. He's still from out there. And then he got to Mexico City, and then he got to Spain, and he still kind of lived in, I don't think he lived in the city. He was always, it's very interesting. So his taste in music was terrible. This is what Frisson says. He had horrible taste in music. Obviously, he liked Johnny Cash and Bob Dylan, but also some Mexican rock that he didn't just sing to me, but also mimicked the actions, doing the screams. He terrified me when he did that. He was scary. He looked like a psychopath who'd take out a knife and gut you there and then. The songs had horrible lyrics, a very pedestrian kind of punk, very vulgar, awful. He liked Elvis a lot. The last band... The last band he became a fan of was Morphine. I loaned him the records, and he never returned them. The singer from Morphine, Mark Sandman, died in Italy in 1999, and I think that attracted him too. That was something that happened with Roberto. You'd visit him one day and find him pale. He'd say he was dying, and you'd laugh. So one day in the backseat of Garofano's car, he was lying back listening to a record by Bob Dylan that had just come out. It must have been Love and Theft from 2001. So he was lying in the back as though on his deathbed and improvising grandiose statements. I told him to stop screwing around, and he said things like, a golden light covers me and surrounds me in the moment. Bob, Dylan, I deliver myself to you. Suddenly there was an ominous silence. It was night, and we started to say his name, but he didn't answer. Alfredo and I looked at each other until he finally woke up and said, scary, isn't it? He was always playing those kind of pranks.
Huh. Wow.
So this is a man who knows he's dying, who proceeds to write one of the greatest novels of the past 100 years.
Yeah.
Which is 2666. Take it away, Abby. What do you got for us?
What do you say? Okay. Dark. Yeah. So Bolaño had heard about these murders that were going on in Ciudad Juarez. Just women, hundreds of women turning up dead. Nobody's got any answers. It might be cartels. Is it a serial killer? We don't know. And he became increasingly preoccupied with this case. And this idea of like detectives and things comes up a lot. And I did read an interview with him where he said that his like dream alternate career would be to be a homicide detective. So he's sort of writing the alternative detective novels here.
It's actually kind of common in novelists, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's something about the forensic, I think, or trying to solve a mystery.
Yeah.
And yeah, so he became preoccupied with these cases and decided to write about it. And we ended up with this 5-page epic, 2666. And it starts out with these, it says it's called The Part About the Critics, but they're more academics. These 4 academics from Italy, France, Spain, and the UK who are concerned with this mysterious, not very well known German author called Benno von Archibaldi, which is not a German name. And I apologize, he is not a real author in real life, but in the book he is a real author. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, they're and they're such like beautifully painted academics as well, because they're all kind of like emotionally stunted, and like 3 of them are men, and they all fall in love with the one that's a woman because she's the only person who's interested in the same thing that they're interested in. And they sort of go to all these conferences around Europe to talk about this author that they then try to track down.
It's kind of shades of White Noise, if you know the DeLillo novel. Yeah, the great DeLillo novel about the professor of Hitler studies who doesn't speak German.
And The Tunnel, William Gass, is kind of tread some of that same territory too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So they start off in Germany trying to find him, and they go to speak to his publisher who's dead. So they end up getting a meeting with his publisher's wife. And there's a little excerpt that I have here from during that meeting. And it goes, then they went back to talking about Archibaldi, and Mrs. Bubis showed them a very odd review that had appeared in a Berlin newspaper after the publication of Ludwig Archibaldi's first novel. The review by someone called Schleiermacher tried to sum up the novelist's personality in a few words. Intelligence, average. Character, epileptic. Scholarship, sloppy. Storytelling ability, chaotic. Prosody, chaotic. German usage, chaotic. Average intelligence and sloppy scholarship are easy to understand. What did he mean by epileptic character, though? That Archambaldi had epilepsy? That he wasn't right in the head? That he suffered attacks of a mysterious nature? And that he was a compulsive reader of Dostoevsky? There was no physical description of the writer in the piece. We never knew who this man Schleiermacher was, said Mrs. Bubis, and sometimes my late husband would joke that Archambaldi himself had written the review, but he knew as well as I did that that wasn't true. So Archambaldi is this kind of like Joker type figure. We never actually hear about any of his work or what his novels are like, just that these people are obsessed with him. And then there's eventually this rumor that he's gone to Mexico and he's ended up in this town, this border town called Santa Teresa, which is the fictional Ciudad Juarez in this novel. And so 3 of the 4 academics go out there in search of him. And one of the things about 2666 is that each section just ends very abruptly. Like they don't draw to a conclusion. So I guess you could assume by this kind of format that Bolaño is kind of saying to us, like, this timeline is still existing. I'm just dropping it now and I'm moving you on to the next one. And the next one is about a Chilean professor named Amalfitano, who was living in Barcelona with his wife and daughter. His wife went insane and left him for a homosexual poet who she claims that is in love with her because they hooked up at a party, which may or may not be true. And this guy, Amalfitano, ends up getting a job at a university in Santa Teresa. So he moves there with his daughter. And as we're sort of like moving through each section of 2666, the murders start to creep in to the narrative, and like they're very much in the background in the first part. There's a little bit of more of an awareness of them in the second part because this guy's got a daughter. He's going a bit insane. He finds a geometry book that he doesn't remember owning or packing from Barcelona, and he hangs it up on a clothesline because he recalls a story where somebody had said that you should do that if you're a newlywed couple, hang a book of geometry up on the clothesline.
Oh yeah, that's when yeah, everybody knows about that.
Metaphors.
So yeah, his daughter's just sort of existing in Santa Teresa. He's hanging books on clotheslines, and that's like a very it's probably one of the shorter sections of the book. We then move on to the part about fate, which is about an African-American journalist who's nicknamed Oscar Fate, and he works for a predominantly Black publication, and starts out sort of interviewing former Black Panther members, but then when somebody is ill, he's sent to Santa Teresa to cover a boxing match that is happening down there. And he finds out about these killings that are going on and is sort of like, well, this would be a more interesting story. And I mean, the kind of like everybody in this novel, his boss is like, no, nobody cares about that. Like, we sent you there for the boxing, like focus on the boxing. And he ends up meeting Rosa Amalfitano, who is the Amalfitano from the guy from the section before's daughter, who by this point has become a journalist. And Amalfitano is like, you need to get her out of Santa Teresa and into the United States. And there's a section
because there's
here,
a threat of every woman in that town is in danger, basically, right?
basically.
Yeah.
Like if you're a living, breathing woman in Santa Teresa, there is a high possibility you will end up not living and breathing. And we've got a section here where another woman talks about the killings in Santa Teresa. It is.
I need to say too that these were conceived as 5 distinct novels, and one of them is quite literally a list of murdered women in Ciudad Juarez on the Mexican border.
It's grueling to read.
Grim.
That too.
Yeah.
Grim. Mm-hmm.
So this is we're still in part 3. You have to listen to women. You should never ignore a woman's fears. It was something like that, remembered Fate, that his mother or her neighbor, the deceased Miss Holly, used to say when both of them were young and he was a boy. For an instant, he imagined a set of scales, like the scales of blind justice, except instead of 2 platters, there were 2 bottles, or something like 2 bottles. The bottle on the left was clear and full of desert sand. There were several holes in it through which the sand escaped. The bottle on the right was full of acid. There were no holes in it, but the acid was eating away at the bottle from the inside. On the way to Tucson, Fate didn't recognize any of the things he'd seen a few days before, when he'd traveled the same road in the opposite direction. What used to be my right is my left, and there are no points of reference. Everything is erased. Towards noon, they stopped at a diner on the highway. A group of Mexicans who looked like jobless migrant workers watched them from the counter. They were drinking bottled water and local sodas, and the names and logos odd to Fate. New businesses would soon fail. The food was bad. Rosa was sleepy, and when they got back to the car, she fell asleep. Fate remembered the words of Guadalupe Roncal. No one pays attention to these killings, but the secret of the world is hidden in them. Did Guadalupe Roncal say that, or was it Rosa? At moments, the highway was like a river. The suspected killer said it, thought Fate, the giant fucking albino who appeared along with the black cloud. The giant fucking albino refers to a prisoner that him and Rosa go to the prison to talk to, who's suspected of the killings, but the killings continue even though he's locked up, which becomes pertinent as the story goes on. But it goes shortly, a few pages later, goes into part 4, which is a very difficult listen if you're listening to it on audiobooks, because it is, like you say, essentially a list of like women getting brutally raped and murdered. And we had a full cast, again, like the Savage Detectives, of corrupt and idiotic police officers, journalists, there's a psychic, criminals, everybody has got something to do with the investigation of these women, and an FBI agent comes in at one point. And going on the list theme, there's a section of the book which goes on for 2 pages, where one of the cops just tells bang, 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 like sexist jokes about women. And it's interesting because like there's probably almost as many jokes as there are dead women in the like that section of the novel. And you sort of get a sense of like these people who are trying to investigate these crimes are not really trying that hard, because this is what they think of women. Whereas as like Bolaño kind of in this section also offers up like an alternative crime that's happening, whereas there's this guy who's going around like urinating in churches, and like the police are super on it to try and catch this guy, because his crime is just like disturbing people left, right, and center. But these dead women keep popping up,
And everybody just kind of goes,
3 or 4
oh,
a week. Yeah. Another dead woman.
Yeah.
And the whole project here is about how we've learned nothing from the horrors of violence in the 20th century, and that we ignore it, and that ultimately literature is futile, and that each one of these lives on their own is a project of its own, but as a whole become this sort of numbing statistic.
Mm-hmm.
And he forces you to look at it. It's it's extreme. And remember, this is a man who's dying.
Yeah. And it's very, not cold, but like very forensic, the way he describes these women that turn up dead. Like the section 4, aside from the little bits of color of the characters of the police and the psychic or the politicians or whoever it might be, it is very much like, these are the facts of the case. It's like a police file.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the idea that is literary is so extraordinary. And then when it's jammed in the middle, is it the second of the 5 books or the third? I think it's the third.
This is the 4th.
The 4th. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's the longest one. It's like 300 pages, I think.
Boy. Wow. Okay. Problems at home, Roberto?
Well, no, he was just obsessed with Ciudad Juarez.
Well, and I remember reading in one of these books, too, that at a certain point his friends got sick of hearing him ask.
Right. Because he was
asking about the murders.
Yeah, he was still in Blanes, wherever he was, and he was just contacting journalists and people out in Mexico about these killings and what was going on, but hadn't. Well, obviously he was very ill, so he hadn't ventured back to investigate himself. But
it's such an interesting indictment of the culture as a serial killer, just violence permeating the world in the 90s,
right?
And how comfortable the majority of us live as that's happening, and how we somehow, it doesn't register, it doesn't add up.
Mm-hmm.
All the dead bodies on the border, all the dead bodies in Juarez, the horrible things that the cartels do, the way they play, their rules of engagement. Like most of us, we don't even want to begin to think of the horror that is just down the street, really.
Yeah.
Just down 35W. If you want to drive, you can go right down there. Takes a couple days.
Yeah, like none of it's covered up. All of these women are just like dumped. Like essentially in the Sonora Desert. It's like, it's not nobody's even sort of trying to like cover their tracks.
Yeah, there's this sort of we'll never get to the bottom of this. So, yeah.
Basically it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess for anybody who, reading that passage, it's not pleasant reading necessarily, though I remember it being well written. But it is sort of but this is actually, this is happening. Basically, I mean, not in every single detail, right? But like,
and he's just presented it to us, which is kind of wonderful. It's like, I don't have to dress this up in any way.
Right.
This is happening out there, and
well, I'll have to confess that it's grotesque, but it is entertaining. It's entertaining the way American Psycho is entertaining.
Well, and that's this particular part of the book did feel very American Psycho to me.
Mm-hmm. There's a similar passage in Jose Saramago's The Gospel According to Jesus Christ, where God comes down to Jesus. And it basically explains to him all of the violence and sacrifices and murders and things that will happen in Jesus's name, explains it to Jesus, like in the future. And it goes on for page after page and like all of the saints that got impaled and set on fire and it goes on and on and on. And it reminds me of this, where it's like, if it pulled punches, it wouldn't do what it's trying to do. You can't get that effect from just one of these instances. It's got to be the landslide of them in a way. Yeah, it's crazy.
May I read a few passages from this, or do you have something?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, all right. January 1993. So these are the murders of 112 women between 93 and 97. 1993, Nirvana, right?
Yeah.
This is the time that we're dealing with. January 1993. From then on, the killings of women began to be counted, but it's likely there had been other deaths before. The name of the first victim was Esperanza Gomez Saldana, and she was 13. Maybe for the sake of convenience, maybe because she was the first to be killed in 1993, she heads the list. Although surely there were other girls and women who died in 1992. Other girls and women who didn't make it onto the list were never found, who were buried in unmarked graves in the desert or whose ashes were scattered in the middle of the night, when not even the person scattering them knew where he was, what place he had come to. It's worth noting, and I'm going to read a few more. It is literary. It's written in a style, as you can hear. On November 16, the body of another woman was found on the back lot of the Casai Maquiadora in Colonia San Bartolome. According to the initial examination, the victim was between 18 and 22, and the cause of death, according to the forensic report, was asphyxiation due to strangulation. She was completely naked, and her clothes were found 5 yards away, hidden in the bushes. Actually, not all of her clothes were found, just a pair of black leggings and red panties. 2 days later, she was identified by her parents as Rosaria Marquina, 19, who disappeared on November 12th while she was out dancing at Salon Montana on Avenida Carranza, not far from Colonia Veracruz, where they lived. It just so happened that both the victim and her parents worked at the Casai Maquiadora. According to the medical examiners, the victim was raped several times before she died. And one more. A week after the discovery of the corpse of the 13-year-old girl on the outskirts of El Obelisco, the body of a girl about 16 was found in the Cananea Highway. The dead girl was a little under 5'4" and slightly built, but she had long black hair. She had been stabbed only once in the abdomen, a stab so deep that the blade had literally pierced her through. But her death, according to the medical examiner, was caused by strangulation and a fracture of the hyoid bone. The victim, according to the police, was probably a hitchhiker who had been raped on her way to Santa Teresa. All attempts to identify her were in vain, and the case was closed. There's a sense as you're reading it that there's a killer stalking the land. And there's a feeling that it will never be solved. The resources will never be put into it. And it's futile. And I don't know what it stands in for, but it's deeply moving, particularly in the context of the rest of the novel. Yeah. Whew. All right, Abby, you want to bring us home? What happens in the fifth section of?
Everybody goes. They all come back to life. And
no. So the fifth section of the novel actually is one of the most plot-driven pieces of Bolano writing that I've ever seen. We go back to well, no, that's spoilers. I'll approach it differently. So we meet a young man named Hans Reiter, who is a young German, and he's sort of introduced as this kid that's like too tall. Like he was taller than everybody at his school, taller than the other kids. And like, interestingly, when we were saying earlier about Bolano being like a boy who was out of whack, this kid is a boy out of whack who has a younger sister. So there's sort of like some parallels coming in there. We see him go off to World War II. He's German. We see him go off to World War II. He gets stuck in the Eastern Bloc for some time. His family don't know where he is. He eventually encounters again this baroness who his mother used to clean for when he was younger. He gets a girlfriend. Like all of these things sort of happen. And then somewhere along the line, he decides to become a writer and gives himself the pen name Benno von Archambault and becomes the writer that the academics were obsessed with in the first section. And we sort of go, it sort of chronicles his journey throughout Germany and Italy, and I think he goes to France at some point, but never really leaving Europe. So you're sort of left kind of wondering, how does this tie in to these killings in Santa Teresa? Because everything else has had this tie-in, and then eventually, as we're kind of approaching the end of Archambault's story, Bolaño switches and he says, well, what about his younger sister Lotta? And then we start hearing the story of his younger sister Lotta, who grows up without him because he's gone off to war, eventually marries, has a son, and this son turns out to be the German that is jailed in Santa Teresa, suspected of these killings. And he didn't commit them because they continue to happen even though he's in jail.
Well, as like Kevin said, there's almost like it's almost, I remember it being almost like it's not people
it's not
doing it.
It's like a thing.
It's like a phenomena.
It's a Cohen-esque pure evil. It's
right.
Yeah.
So like every one of them could have been killed by an ex-boyfriend or a father or like whoever, but it's all happening and it's all similar. So Lotta, the Archambault's sister, goes out to Mexico to visit her son, who she finds out is in a Mexican jail because they've been estranged for a little while. And on the trip there, she picks up a book in the airport by Benno von Archambault, who she doesn't know is her brother, and she starts to read what is essentially the story of her childhood. Gets in touch with him through the publisher, and this is how Archambault ends up traveling to Mexico because he goes to visit his nephew. And the Bolano doesn't leave us with much of a resolution, but I'm going to read a little section from towards the end, which is funny to me because it's him going off on another tangent. So it goes, Lotta's told Archambault that her son's in a Mexican prison and asks if he'll sort it. And then this is the chapter afterwards. First, Pukla. If you want a good chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry ice cream, you can order a First Pukla. They will bring you an ice cream in 3 flavors, but not just any 3 flavors, only chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry. That's a First Pukla. When Archambault left his sister, he went on to Hamburg, where he planned to catch a direct flight to Mexico. Since the flight didn't leave until the next morning, he went for a walk around a park he didn't know, a big park full of trees and little paved paths, along which women strolled with their children and young people skated, and every so often students rode on bicycles. And he sat on the terrace of a bar, a terrace quite a distance from the bar itself, almost in the middle of the woods, and he began to read and ordered a sandwich and a beer and paid for them. Then he ordered a First Pukla and paid for it because on the terrace one had to pay immediately for anything one had. The only other person there was 3 tables away, wrought iron tables, heavy, elegant, and probably hard to steal. A gentleman of advanced age, though not as old as Archambault, reading a magazine and sipping a cappuccino. As Archambault was about to finish his ice cream, the gentleman asked whether he'd liked it. I did, said Archambault, and he smiled. Drawn or encouraged by this friendly smile, the gentleman got up from his chair and sat down 1 table away. Allow me to introduce myself, he said. My name is Alexander Firstpukler, and how shall I say, creator of this ice cream, he said. The creator of this ice cream, he said, was a forebear of mine, a very brilliant Firstpukler, a great traveler, an enlightened man, whose main interests were botany and gardening. Of course, he thought, if he ever thought about it at all, that he would be remembered for some of the many small works he wrote and published, mostly travel chronicles. They're not necessarily travel chronicles in the modern sense, but little books that are still charming today and, how shall I say, highly perceptive. Anyway, as perceptive as they could be. Little books that made it seem as if the ultimate purpose of each of his trips was to examine a particular garden. Gardens sometimes forgotten, forsaken, abandoned to their fate, and whose beauty my distinguished forebear knew how to find amid the weeds and the neglect. His little books, despite their, how shall I say, botanical trappings, are full of clever observations, and from them one gets a rather decent idea of the Europe of his day. A Europe often in turmoil, whose storms on occasion reach the shores of the family castle, located near Görlitz, as you're likely aware. Of course, my forebear wasn't oblivious to the storms, no more than he was oblivious to the vicissitudes of, how shall I say, the human condition. And so he wrote and published, and in his own way, humbly, but in fine German prose, he raised his voice against injustice. I think he had little interest in knowing where the soul goes when the body dies, although he wrote about that too. He was interested in dignity, and he was interested in plants. About happiness, he said not a word. I suppose because he considered it something strictly private and perhaps, shall I say, treacherous or elusive. He had a great sense of humor, although some passages of his books contradict me there. And since he wasn't a saint or even a brave man, he probably did think about posterity. The bust, the equestrian statue, the folios preserved forever in a library. What he never imagined was that he would be remembered for lending his name to a combination of 3 flavors of ice cream. And I can assure you. So what do you think? I don't know what to think, said Archambaldi. No one remembers the botanist's first buchler now. No one remembers the model gardener. No one has read the writer. But everyone at some moment has tasted a first buchler, which is the best and most pleasant in spring and fall. Why not summer, said Archambaldi. Because in summer it can be cloying. Ice is the best in summer, not ice cream. Suddenly the park lights came on, although there was a second of total darkness as if someone had tossed a black blanket over parts of Hamburg. The gentleman sighed. He must have been about 70, and then he said, "Mysterious legacy, don't you think?" "You're right, I do," said Archambaldi. He got up and took his leave of the descendant of Verspukler. Soon afterwards, he left the park, and the next morning he was on his way to Mexico. So
they're not talking about ice cream.
They're not talking about ice cream.
I picked it up. And that's the genius of Bolano and this idea where so much narrative seems to suggest that what's the phrase? Pure evil was conquered in World War II, right? And it will never happen again. And it's like, it's happening every day.
Happening all the time. Yeah.
It's happening all the time, every day. And you don't see it because these women are detritus. And the reason they're detritus is because society treats them that way. There's nobody looks, right? Nobody bothers looking. And so he devotes an entire novel to the looking.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we are into the 4th hour of the Roberto Bolaño episode. I think it's fair to say this is a certified banger.
Yes.
We'll have to see. We'll have to see what the audience thinks. Again, we want to hear from you, Abbie. Where can people find you? I know you have a great website. You've got a lot of stuff going on. It's abbielucas.com, and then you're on the Bird website too. Is it under your name?
I am on the Bird website and the Instagrams at Abbie Lucas. But the Abbie is spelled Abbie.
Yes. And we're going to endeavor to put out at least one of our screenplays. We're going to do like a reading of that through the theater company, which is badmouthtc.com. That's my theater company. And so we do our own art too, and we're not rapping about
death and things also.
Yes. That's a screenplay about a life coach who falls in love with death. It's I don't know what Bolaño would think of it, but I have children, and I certainly would love to see a screenplay get made. So
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't have any children, but I have
Right.
expenses. So
sure. Let's bring this on home. I have a few more quotes from the great man, and now we have to understand that he's writing 2666 right up until the end. This is from his friend Perez de Vega. With Roberto, it is very difficult to separate his personal and professional lives. He was, as Bruno Montagnier says, a man work. The unfinished part of 266 is the part with the crimes. He wrote the Arcamboldi section first. The last words written for that novel were written in February 2003. The rest of the time he spent living and doing other things. The crimes, one after another, were too much for him. It was very hard work. He said that he couldn't cope with any more crimes. He wanted to save his energy to recover from the transplant. He was waiting for this liver transplant. That was when he started to put together The Insufferable Gaucho. He wrote 2 new stories, The Insufferable Gaucho and Police Rat. He put together that book because he said that it would be his economic support for the post-operative period. He said, "This will give me the freedom to finish 2666 and edit it." Also, he wasn't writing so intensely anymore. 2 whole days would go by without him turning on the computer. What people say about him writing right up until the night before his death is a very nice literary story, but it's not true. I want to read something he said about civilization itself, which...
But that is interesting that it was difficult for him to write that part because it's difficult to read.
Yes.
You can feel it.
Hard. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Civilization from Roberto. For the Robert Duvall character in Apocalypse Now, there was no better breakfast than the smell of napalm. According to him, it smelled like victory. Perhaps. The smell of burning, with that tinge of acid said to be left hanging in the air, is sometimes like victory and other times like fear. I've never smelled napalm. I've smelled gunpowder, and gunpowder definitely doesn't smell like victory. Sometimes it smells like verbena, and other times it smells like fear. In contrast, the smell of tear gas, which tends to precede the smell of gunpowder in some countries, is reminiscent of sporting events and rotting guts. Triumphal marches always smell like dust, a hyaline and solar dust that clings like leprosy to the skin and arms. Crowds in closed spaces smell like dust and death, which may be the same thing. Crowds in big open spaces like stadiums or esplanades smell like fear. I hate soccer matches, concerts, and rallies. The fear that clings to them is unbearable. Instead, I like to walk with the dirty old men along the Paseo Maritimo in Blanes in the summer. I like to watch the beach. There, from that triumphal throng of half-naked bodies, beautiful and ugly, fat and thin, perfect and imperfect, a magnificent smell wafts up to us, the smell of suntan lotion. I like the smell that rises from that mass of bodies in all shapes and sizes. It isn't strong, but it's bracing. Though it isn't perfect, sometimes it's even a sad smell, and possibly metaphysical. The 1,000 lotions, the sunscreens, the smell of democracy, of civilization.
Oof.
That irony, that bite, that anger, you can feel in his in everything. Let's see here. I want to bring us to a close here around the disease and then the Playboy interview at the end. Let's see here. Books. I highly recommend these 2 volumes. If you're interested in Roberto Bolaño, the between parentheses is his own writing, particularly sort of near the end of his life. And then this biography and conversations is quite good. I like these 2. There's a biography that's like this of Bowie that's quite fun. It's just other people talking about David Bowie. You get a really interesting perspective. So let's see here. Now, this is about the disease that he dealt with. Bolaño's disease, as the liver specialist Victor Garcia Blasco, to whom The Insufferable Gaucho is dedicated. Bolaño is more of a friend than a patient, and they used to discuss literature. confirmed to the Chilean magazine Que Pasa, wasn't related to alcohol and certainly not heroin, which he never took. It was a disease of the immune system, the doctor said. He had an immune system that affects the bile ducts and damages the liver, said the doctor. It is a slow-acting disease. At first, he was more worried than anything, and he was fine for a long while. But he suffered the torment of being sick. He was very sensitive, and any test or exploratory procedure was anguish to him. Just to give you some context for what he was dealing with as he was writing 266, I mean, it's the work of a dying man, and a man who is anxiously awaiting a transplant, which unfortunately would never come. And a young man, he was only 50.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's see here. So this is De Vega again being interviewed. Did his disease cause him physical pain? No, the liver doesn't hurt, but he did get tired easily more and more at the end. When I met him, he was a slow man. He walked in an almost feline manner, but that wasn't because of the disease. He was like that. I like that a lot. He does feel like a cat, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Bolaño feels like a cat, not a dog. Yeah. What made his life difficult was the tiredness, and editing the huge novels he wrote obviously tired him. This really gets me down, he used to say. It's quite sad. People always mention his indifference toward his disease. Is that really true? I don't know. When I met him, he took his pills religiously and took care to eat properly, although he enjoyed his food. One of the things that Roberto enjoyed a lot in his final years was a good meal accompanied by good conversation. We went to buy groceries together, walking to a certain butcher, for example, because it had the cuts that we liked. He asked me to make his favorite dishes, although he was also an austere person who could go whole days with a plate of rice and a bowl of vegetable soup. He was both Spartan and an epicure, the two things at once. I like that, that idea of him holding different character. Yeah, such an interesting guy. And he just devoted his life to literature.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Did I read about the liver attack in Philip K. Dick? Yes, I did. I believe I did. The death and everything. So let's get the Playboy interview, and then we will bring this sucker home. Where is that Playboy interview, Mexico? Let me get my editions. You can hear my crumple. I've got my stack here.
You got to go through the stack of Mexican Playboys.
I had
it's got milk
listen, man.
For the lists.
Yeah, for the lists. Yeah, for the stories, Brett. Listen, if the grid goes down, I've got these, and I'm going to be all right, man. We're going to make it.
Going to be lonely.
Nope. All right, let's see here. I'm going to need something to trade for bullets. Okay. All right, let's see here. So this is the Playboy interview. When did you learn that you were gravely ill? In 1992. What parts of your character were changed by your illness? Nothing changed. I discovered that I wasn't immortal, which at the age of 38 is about time I discovered. What things would you like to do before you die? Nothing in particular. Well, I'd rather not die, of course, but sooner or later the great lady makes her entrance. The problem is that sometimes she's no lady, let alone great. Instead, as Nicanor Parra says in a poem, she's a cheap whore, which is enough to make anyone's teeth chatter. Who would you most like to meet in the afterlife? I don't believe in the afterlife. If it exists, I'll be surprised. First thing, I'd sign up for whatever class Pascal was teaching. Did you ever think about killing yourself? Of course. At some point, I survived precisely because I knew I could kill myself if things got worse. Did you ever think you were going crazy? Yes, but I was always saved by my sense of humor. I told myself stories that cracked me up, or I remembered situations that made me roll on the ground laughing. Madness, death, love, which of the three has there been most in your life? I hope with all my heart that it's love. Yeah. Well, so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about his love life and all the rest of it on the After Dark episode for the Patreon subscribers. I do want to get one more thing in to the core episode, which is about his widow. I feel like this is significant enough. I like what you said earlier, Abby, about that relationship and what she maybe said. Roberto, enough poetry, write a novel. We have bills to pay. We have children. You must provide for the family. Your son didn't ask to be born, Roberto.
Yeah, right.
You got responsibilities.
Really, yeah. You don't know the definition of the word responsibility until you have children. I mean, no disrespect, but yeah, it's a different level. Carolina Lopez is Roberto Bolaño's widow. She was married to him for 20 years. She is now in her 50s, very attractive and discreet. She has given very few interviews since the death of her husband, the father of their 2 children. They met in Girona in 1981 when Bolaño was very young and very poor with a susceptibility to depression. They married in 1985 and were always together in some way until his death, although almost every account states that they had periods of separation starting in 1994. He was a man who listened a lot and who got into relationships very deeply, overwhelmingly so, Lopez told her interviewer Eric Hasnut. He was very talkative and spoke to anyone he came across. His first friendships were with fishermen and waiters. His literary friends came later. In a 1998 interview, Bolaño said, "Each of us lives in our own house and we get on much better like that. We've been together for 17 years and I recommend it completely because my wife is basically my friend. So there is absolute respect for each other's freedom." The couple started out living in Blanes so that Roberto could work in Victoria's accessories store, his mother. Shortly afterward, Lopez got a bureaucratic post with the municipality through which she was essentially able to maintain the family. So there you go, heroic woman. In an interview with the journalist Joseph Ma, we wouldn't have these novels if she hadn't done that. Most probably, or not as many of them. Many such cases. She remembered her husband as a passionate person who was unable to forgive disloyalty and who liked games of strategy. She insists on dispelling the myth about Bolaño being a drug addict or being a writer who lived on literary awards. Meanwhile, Lopez is the sole administrator of the author's archive, which she described in the interview mentioned above. When Roberto died, we found boxes with an incredible number of manuscripts, notes, projects, especially poetry, typed documents. A lot of that material is typed on a typewriter, so we were able to date it because in 93 he bought an electronic typewriter, and in 95 we got a computer. There are also the computer files and a lot of printed pages that Roberto hadn't saved on a disk or on a hard disk. We've started the process of classifying all the material and done an initial read. We are in the research phase. And yeah, very interesting. They really have taken pains to manage the estate. There are some other novels that were released after his death. His sister doesn't like to speak in public. I've got a little bit from her. One little quote about him. Yeah, this is quite funny. "Yes, he was a very well-loved brother, but also a brother who used to infuriate me." All right, so we're coming to the end here, and I'm just going to read a little bit more. Bolaño's death in 2003 came after a long period of declining health. He suffered from liver failure and had been on a liver transplant waiting list while working on 2666. He was second or third on the list at the time of his death. Maybe get on the organ donor list, people.
Yeah.
You never know. Yeah, who knows what other great writing we could have enjoyed, but let's not dwell on it. 6 weeks before he died, Bolaño's fellow Latin American novelists hailed him as the most important figure of his generation at an international conference he attended in Seville. Among his closest friends were the novelists Rodrigo Fresson and Enrique Villamatas. Fresson's tribute included the statement that Roberto emerged as a writer at a time when Latin America no longer believed in utopias, when paradise had become hell, and that sense of monstrousness and waking nightmares and constant flight from something horrid permeates 2666 and all his work. His books are political, Fresson observed, but in a way that is more personal than militant or demagogic, that is closer to the mystique of the beatniks than the boom. And the boom is the Latin American literature boom with Marquez and everything. Yeah. In Fresson's view, he was one of a kind, a writer who worked without a net, who went all out with no breaks, and in doing so created a new way to be a great Latin American writer. So quite amazing. On the 1st of July, 2003, he was hospitalized with liver failure at the Vall d'Hebron University Hospital in Barcelona, and he died 14 days later on the 15th of July. I have, 2 weeks in the hospital. I have 3 more little nuggets to read before we do the After Dark and talk about the women. In one of his stories, Dentist, Bolaño appears to set out his basic aesthetic principles. What was Bolaño about? After all this, after going into our fourth hour here, what is this about? I know, right? Time flies. It's going to be 2666 by the time we're done here. Yeah. The narrator pays a visit to an old friend, a dentist. The friend introduces him to a poor Indian boy who turns out to be a literary genius. At one point during a long evening of inebriated conversation, the dentist expresses what he believes to be the essence of art. That's what art is, he said. The story of a life in all its particularity. It's the only thing that really is particular and personal. It's the expression and at the same time the fabric of the particular. And what do you mean by the fabric of the particular, I asked, supposing he would answer. Art. I was also thinking indulgently that we were pretty drunk already and that it was time to go home. But my friend said, what I mean is the secret story. The secret story is the one we'll never know, although we're living it from day to day, thinking we're alive, thinking we've got it all under control, and the stuff we overlook doesn't matter. But every damn thing matters. It's just that we don't realize. We tell ourselves that art runs on one track and life, our lives, on another. We don't even realize that's a lie. And now, Bolaño was survived by his Spanish wife and their 2 children, whom he once called my only motherland. In his last interview, published by the Mexican edition of Playboy magazine, Bolaño said he regarded himself as a Latin American, adding that my only country is my 2 children and wife, and perhaps, though in second place, some moments, streets, faces, or books that are in me and which one day I will forget.
Wow.
Yeah. And one more final read before I ask the closing question. Thank you both for indulging me. I feel like I've held forth a lot. Abbie, thank you for your reading and your generous sharing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Friend of the show. And I think we have to, you're going to be on the hook to do Roald Dahl when we decide to do Roald Dahl. That might be something for year 3 of Art of Darkness. But yeah, just really grateful to have you on. And I hope people will go and check out your work. You're a fine filmmaker. And I'm really excited for whatever your first feature film ends up looking like. And it's a lot of fun. And I really enjoy our writing partnership too. I have to say that it's been years and years and really fruitful too. We get some stuff done. It's good. Yeah. And we have some laughs. We have a lot of yucks.
We have a lot of yucks. Me too. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. All right. So let me find this. I got to find the close of the introduction here. Yes. Is this what I meant? Yes. So this is the introduction of the biography and conversations, Monica Marastain. I found out that Bolaño had died when a friend called me very early from Spain. Moni, have you heard? Said my friend. My brief correspondence had given me a glimpse of an amazingly generous writer. Afterward, I started to ask myself how the people who knew him best remembered the great author, the ones who had enjoyed many long conversations with him, the ones with whom he had shared his youth, childhood, and maturity. This was the motivation for writing this book, to find out more about Bolaño from the people who played important roles in his life. My project here has been to make some attempt to bring him back, to let those who knew him best have their say. It was impossible to include all of them. That wasn't the intention. And so we've leaned heavily on this book, and we appreciate both of these authors, both obviously Bolaño himself, the translator of this other book, Natasha Vimmer, and then this book from Monica. But there's a quote here that I really like. The Chilean political activist Rodrigo Quijada, now also deceased, said this about Bolaño. Bolaño is one of those people you meet at a certain moment in your life who you will always remember clearly and with great fondness. People who have met Bolaño know that what I'm saying is true. He is the kind of man you miss at a gathering. If only Bolaño were here, we used to say when someone started to get unbearable. And that is the life of Roberto Bolaño, the life and work of Roberto Bolaño, the great Chilean poet who was exiled and only had the nation of his own family, and then, of course, his own mind and his literature. And I don't even know if we did him justice.
Yeah,
I don't.
Well, no, you guys did a great job. There's so much there. I mean, yeah, no, I learned a lot. That was fantastic. Thank you guys.
Gotta ask, and I'm gonna start with you, Brad, and then we're gonna do 30 more minutes on the After Dark about the ladies. One of his 3 vices that I discovered: poetry, cigarette, and women. See, you could do a lot worse. You really could. No heroin. I was surprised. Yeah, heroin. Don't do heroin. Don't do heroin. Because I had that impression too. That was the rumor that had gone around upon his death, that it was all used because you think liver failure, but apparently it's worth remembering. Just some random horrible thing can happen to you. Yeah. No,
they're not good for the liver.
Nature just decides you're going to die, and you're dead. There you go.
True.
Brad, if Roberto Bolaño was alive today, what would he be doing?
He'd be a billionaire from writing novels. He would have bought Twitter or something, It's the most lucrative. No, I have to assume that he'd be still writing novels. I would assume that they would be getting even. I think his arc would have been stranger and stranger and stranger and stranger in terms of the work, until at some point towards the end, like a number of writers have done, he just wrote something extremely lucid and clear and straightforward, and then that would have been it. That's what I think, but I don't know. What do I know? Poetry.
Abbie.
Maybe he'd go back to poetry too.
Yeah,
maybe.
I think he might have gone back to poetry. Yeah. Abbie, what do you think Roberto Bolaño would be doing if he was alive still?
Well, his son is a filmmaker, so I'd like to think that they'd be arguing about how to collaborate on something that Roberto had written.
I like that. Yeah.
The film rights to the Savage Detectives. How do you make that as a movie that doesn't just end up being terrible?
Make it like a mockumentary.
You have to make several movies. It can't be just one.
It's like an HBO television. It's a television series.
Yeah,
there you go. It's prestige TV. The Savage Detectives. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, he might be in Hollywood. Oh, that's sort of hard to imagine. Yeah. But who knows? What would have happened after 2666 came out? Who knows?
Yeah.
And one final time, we're all gringos. We
are all gringos.
Yes. We don't speak very much Spanish, so we hope we've done a good job and respected his legacy, and obviously nothing but respect. We really admire the work, and we're going to talk a little more about it on the After Dark. I'm Kevin Kautzman, Brad Kelly, Abbie Lucas. Find us on the patreon.com/artofdarkpod. I'm going to go read some poetry in the shower.
On your laminated tiles.
On my laminated poetry. My laminated poetry. Yeah. Wink, wink, Mexican Playboy. And we'll come back. We will come back and do another 30 minutes.
All right. Woo!